Errico malatesta at the coffee shop. According to a digital edition proofread by us, we can alert us to possible errors in interpreting OCR errors. Preface. These dialogues have their story, modest, but capable of interesting the reader. Errico Malatesta began them in March 1897 while, clandestinely, he was editing, almost single-handedly, in Ancona, the periodical l'Agitazione, the entire international police being on the lookout for him. There was some suspicion of his presence in Ancona, and the small town was crisscrossed with spies who, under the most grotesque disguises, were looking for the conspirator. He, with no other precautions than having cut his beard and not showing himself in the streets in the company of known anarchists, lived there quietly, and calmly moved around the city, his pipe in his mouth, smiling at the friends he met who, in fear of compromising him, hastened to turn their heads. Little by little, he knew almost the whole of subversive Ancona. Not only the anarchists, but socialists and republicans knew of his presence, had spoken to him. However, after more than 8 months, the police were still looking for him. He was discovered by chance, by the imprudence of a person outside of politics who, in the street, among passers-by, spoke, without knowing who it was, of a man who lived in hiding floor above his, in his own house. In the evening, informed friends suggested that Malatesta change accommodation, but he refused. There was now a statute of limitations for his condemnation of Rome which had forced him to so many years of wandering life, and he preferred to start living free again like all the others, or rather much less free, more monitored and more exposed to being arrested at the first opportunity. The next morning, a swarm of security agents and a delegate only had to push the door of the room, and the man who was there, quietly writing, was ordered to say his name, replied, "I am Errico Malatesta." Taken to the station, he was released after a few hours. These at the cafe dialogues were therefore begun during this period of Malatesta's life, when his condition as a fugitive almost absolutely prohibited him from leaving the city for conferences. I say almost because, despite everything, he did take a little trip from time to time. Under the name of Joseph Rinaldi he had, in fact, delivered various propaganda speeches in Pibitano, Gisi, Poligno, etc. But he had to be wary and give most of his time to the editorial staff of the newspaper, l'Agitazione, which, during the few months it was edited by Malatesta, exercised such a great influence on the direction the movement would take. Anarchist was more of a review than a newspaper. Collaborating there, signing with their own name or pseudonyms or not signing at all, Pietro Gori, Felice Vezzani, Rodolfo D'Ambrosio, Genunzio Bentini, Aristide Ciccarelli, Saverio Merlino, Nino Samaha, Emilio Recchioni, Vivaldo Lacchini, Augusto Giardini, Giuseppe Ciancabilla, some dead, others silently withdrawn from anarchism, others passed into different or enemy camps, and several still whose names escape me. The Ancona comrades, and especially our old Cesare Agostinelli, urged Malatesta to write dialogues. This is how he began the conversations at the cafe, the idea of which must have been suggested to him by his frequentation of a popular cafe where he was the only subversive. One of the regular customers was a delegate of the PS. Security police, who often had the opportunity to speak with Malatesta without knowing what good prey he had at hand, and where anarchism must certainly be a subject of discussion like everywhere in Ancona, because the anarchists were then much talked about there, because of their active propaganda and the frequent trials that they put on their backs. But once discovered and identified by the police, Malatesta began his lecture tours, neglected the newspaper somewhat, and the dialogues were interrupted. Moreover, 3 months later he was already in prison, from where he was transferred to the Domicilio Coto in July 1898, and in March 1899 he fled abroad. O Café thus remained at the 10th dialogue, and these 10 dialogues were then reproduced by other newspapers, published as brochures in America, Switzerland, and Italy, and translated into several languages. Malatesta only thought of completing them 15 years later, in 1913, when he came from London to Ancona to direct his new newspaper Volanta, a title he found and which made his fortune. Other newspapers and magazines of the most diverse ideas appropriated it without scruples. Malatesta republished in Volanta the old revised and corrected dialogues and followed them with 4 new ones. But, just after a dialogue which ended with, "We will talk about it next time," there was another long interruption. The Red Week of March and Romagna came, in which Malatesta took part, and immediately afterwards he had to take refuge again in London. Almost 6 years passed, and after the war Malatesta returned to Italy in the way everyone knows, to go to Milan to the newspaper Umanità Nova. He then, in 1920, had something completely different in mind than the now forgotten dialogues, and certainly did not think of getting his hands on them again. But, someone who had offered him hospitality for a fortnight so that he could rest from his feverish work, put the forgotten dialogues before his eyes and, with gentle violence, pushed him to see them again, to complete them and add and intersperse other dialogues which are published here for the first time. Readers will see that the anarchist of the dialogues, Georges, or Errico Malatesta to better say, ends his conversations at the café, by greeting all his interlocutors because he has to leave without knowing when he will return. In writing these last words, Malatesta said to his host, "No one will ever know how literally true it is that I must leave without knowing when I will return." It was Saturday, October 16, 1920. The same evening Errico Malatesta left for Milan, and the next morning he was arrested and received hospitality, in the prisons of San Vittore. 2 days later the house where Malatesta had spent his last days of freedom underwent a thorough search by the police. We looked for hidden weapons and explosives, but we found nothing. The only bomb in this house, the manuscript of this little volume, had been entrusted to another person carrying weapons as a precaution. Malatesta did not review his dialogues again. Out of prison once again, he once again has something else on his mind. He will now see them well and truly printed again. He will accept, I hope, that I took the liberty of adding these 4 explanatory and semi-historical words. They will undoubtedly make it clear why there is a difference in tone between the first and last chapters, the fruit of such diverse times and such different circumstances. Certain allusions to the black misery of the workers, more than 20 years old, then corresponded to the most exact reality. Today they may seem hyperbolic to those who do not know how to establish a relationship between certain assertions and the always persistent disproportion between increased needs and the always insufficient means to meet them. And besides, if the working class does not work energetically to ward off them, these times of harsh poverty which seem to be over could well return. It even seems that they are approaching at a running pace. Furthermore, we will see how certain things which seemed, when they were said, to be exaggerations or arbitrary assertions are today recognized truths, confirmed by the facts, admitted by almost everyone. Some may be called fulfilled prophecies. But I only wanted to write here external clarifications without going into the subject treated by the author. Readers will have themselves realized my intentions and will have made the remarks that, going beyond my intention, I began to express. Bologna, December 25, 1921. Luigi Federi. At the coffee shop. I. Prosper, bold bourgeois who has a veneer of political economy and other sciences. But yes, we know that. There are people who go hungry, women who prostitute themselves, children who die from lack of care. You always say the same thing, you get boring eventually. Let us enjoy our ice cream in peace. Yes, there are 1,000 evils in society: hunger, ignorance, war, crime, the plague, the devil who takes you away, and then? What does it matter to you? Michel, student who frequents socialists and anarchists, how? And then? What can this do to me? You have a comfortable house, a rich table, servants at your command. You educate your sons at college, you send your wife to the waters, for you, everything is fine. And if the world collapses, it doesn't matter to you. But, if you had a little heart, if prosper. Enough, enough, no sermons. And then, leave that tone, young man. You believe me to be insensitive, indifferent to the ills of others. However, my heart is bleeding, boy, bring a brandy and a Havana, my heart is bleeding, but it is not with the heart that we solve major social problems. The laws of nature are immutable, and it is not declamations, it is not effeminate sentimentalism that can change anything. The wise man bends to events and enjoys life as best he can without chasing chimeras. Michael. Ah. Are you talking about natural laws? And what if the poor took it into their heads to correct these famous laws of nature? I know people who make really unreassuring speeches for these brave laws. Prosper. Yes, yes, we know who you hang out with. Just say for me to these scoundrels of socialists and anarchists who you make your favorite company, that, for them and for all those who would be tempted to put their villainous theories into practice, we have good soldiers and excellent gendarmes. Michael. Oh. If you involve soldiers and gendarmes, I will keep quiet. It's as if, to prove to me that I'm wrong, you offered me a fist fight session. However, if you have no other argument than brutal force, don't rely on it too much. Tomorrow you could find yourself the weakest, so what? Prosper. So. Then, if unfortunately this happened, there would be immense disorder, an explosion of evil passions, massacres, pillaging, fires, and then, everything would go back to the way it was before. Some poor person would perhaps have become rich, some rich person would have fallen into poverty, but, in short, nothing would have changed, because the world cannot change. Bring me one of your anarchist agitators and you will see how I will arrange it. They are good for filling your head with nonsense, you who have it empty, but you will see if, with me, they will be able to sustain their absurdities. Michael. Very good. I will bring you a friend of mine who professes socialist and anarchist principles and I will attend your discussion with pleasure and benefit. But, in the meantime, reason a little with me who does not yet have well-formed opinions, but who nevertheless sees very clearly that society, as it is organized today, is contrary to common sense and good heart. Come on, you're so fat and thriving that a little excitement can't do you any harm. This will help your digestion. Prosper. Well, so be it, let's reason. But as it would be better for you to think about studying than to decide questions that are embarrassing for the most learned and wise men. Do you know that I am 20 years older than you? Michael. This does not prove that you have studied more. If I have to judge by what I usually hear you say, if you have studied a lot, I doubt that it has been with much benefit. Prosper. Young man, let's be careful to respect, hey. Michael. But yes. I respect you. However, don't throw my age in my face, as you did earlier against the gendarmes. The reasons are neither old nor young, they are good or bad, that's all. Prosper. Good, keep going. What do you have to say? Michael. But I have to say that I do not understand why the peasants who plow, sow, and harvest do not have enough bread, wine or meat, why the masons, who make the houses, do not have a roof under which to rest, why shoemakers have pierced shoes, why, in short, those who work and produce everything lack what is necessary, while those who do nothing useful wallow in the superfluous. I don't understand why there are people who lack bread when there is so much uncultivated land and so many people who would be so happy to be able to cultivate it, why there are so many masons out of work while so many people need homes, why so many shoemakers, tailors, etc., are out of work while the majority of the population lacks shoes, clothes, and all the things necessary for life. Can you tell me what is the natural law that explains and justifies this nonsense? Prosper. Nothing could be simpler and clearer. To produce, arms are not enough, you need the land, you need the materials, You need the instruments, the premises, the machines, and you also need the means to live while waiting for the products to be manufactured and to be able to deliver them to the market. You need, in short, capital. And your citizens and your workers only have their hands, they cannot, therefore, work if it does not please those who own the land and the capital. And as we are few in number and we have enough to leave our land uncultivated and our capital unprofitable for a certain time, while the workers are many and always pressed by immediate need, it thus happens that they must work when and how it pleases us and on the conditions that we are pleased to impose on them. And when we no longer need their labor, and when we assume that we will gain nothing from making them work, they are forced to remain idle, even when they have the greatest need of the things they could produce. Are you happy now? Can I speak more clearly than that? Michael. Yes, that's what we call speaking clearly. We cannot say the opposite. But, by what right does the land belong only to a few? How is it that capital is in the hands of a few, and precisely of those who do not work? Prosper. Yes, yes, I know everything you can tell me, and I also know the more or less lame reasons that others would oppose to you, the right of property derived from improvements made to the land, from savings through from which labor is transformed into capital, etc. But I like to be more frank. Things, as they are, result from historical facts, are the product of all centuries of human evolution. The whole life of humanity has been, as it is and always will be, a continual struggle. Some people do well, others do poorly. What can I do about it? Too bad for some, so much the better for others. Woe to the vanquished. This is the great law of nature against which there is no possible revolt. What would you like? That I strip myself of what I have and then rot in misery while a few others indulge in my money? Michael. I don't want, precisely, that. But I think, if the workers, taking advantage of the fact that they are numerous and relying on your theory that life is a struggle and that the law derives from the facts, took it into their heads to create a new historical fact which would be to take land and capital, and inaugurate a new right? Prosper. Hey. Certainly, that could confuse our affairs a little. But, we will continue another do. I have to go to the theater now. Good evening everyone. 2. Ambroise, Judge. Listen, Mr. Prosper, now that we are among ourselves, all good conservatives. The other evening, when you were talking with that empty-headed Michel, I didn't want to take part in the discussion, but what way is this to defend institutions? It looked like you were the anarchist. Prosper. Hey. And why? Ambroise. Because you said in essence that the entire current social organization is based on force, thus giving reason to those who, by force, would like to destroy it. But the supreme principles which govern civilized societies, law, morality, religion, do you count them for nothing? Prosper. Parbleu. You always have your mouth full of your right. It's a fault that comes from your job. And to say that if, tomorrow, the government decreed, for example, collectivism, you would condemn the partisans of individual property with the same impassivity as you condemn the anarchists today, and always in the name of the supreme principles of eternal and immutable law. You see clearly that it is a question of words. You say right, I say force, but, ultimately, what counts are the sacrosanct gendarmes, and whoever has them on his side is right. Ambroise. Come on, Mr. Prosper. It is extraordinary how in you the love of sophistry stifles the instincts of the conservative. You don't understand how bad it feels to see a person like you, one of the biggest Whigs in the country, providing arguments to the worst enemies of order. Believe me, let's put an end, at least in public, to this bad habit of arguing among ourselves, and let's all band together to defend the institutions which, through the molly-good-nighty of the times, are receiving severe shocks, and to defend our interests in danger. Prosper. Let's close ranks, so be it, but if we do not take energetic measures, If we do not put an end to liberal doctrinarism, we will achieve nothing. Ambroise. Oh yes, that's for sure. We need strict laws, strictly enforced. But that's not all. With force alone, we do not keep the people subjugated for long, especially in the short term. It is necessary to oppose propaganda to propaganda. We must persuade people that we are right. Prosper. You're fresh, then. My poor friend, I beg you, for our common interests, be careful not to use propaganda. It is a subversive thing, even if it is done by conservatives, and your propaganda would always turn to the advantage of the socialists, anarchists, and other people of this type. Go and convince a hungry man that it is right for him not to eat, especially when he is the one who produced the food. As long as he doesn't think about it and moves forward, blessing God and the boss that things don't get worse, that's good. But the moment he begins to reflect on his condition, everything is over, he becomes an irreconcilable enemy. Yes, yes, propaganda must be avoided at all costs, the press must be stifled, with or without the law, or even against it. Ambroise. Definitely. Certainly. Prosper. Prevent all meetings, dissolve all associations, send to prison all those who think. Caesar, merchant. Slowly, gently, don't let yourself be carried away by passion. Remember that other governments, in better times, adopted the means you advocate, and thus hastened their downfall. Ambroise. Silence. Here is Michel, who comes with an anarchist whom I sentenced last year to 6 months in prison for a subversive manifesto. In reality, between us, the manifesto, as it was written, did not fall within the scope of the law, but what do you want? The criminal intent was there, and then society must be defended. Michael. Good evening, gentlemen. I present to you an anarchist friend who kindly agreed to respond to the challenge launched the other evening by Mr. Prosper. Prosper. But what challenge, what challenge? We chat like this, among friends, to pass the time. So, you want to explain to us what this anarchy is about, which we have never been able to understand anything. Georges, anarchist. I am not acting as an anarchy teacher, and I am not coming to teach an anarchy course. But I can nevertheless defend my ideas. Besides, Monsieur, addressing President Ambroise and in an ironic tone, must know more than me. He has condemned so many people for the crime of anarchy, and as he is certainly a conscientious man, it is not possible that he would have done so without having first studied the matter deeply. Caesar. Come on, let's not ask personal questions. And since we have to talk about anarchy, let's get into the subject right away. See, I also recognize that things are bad and that it is necessary to remedy them. But it is not necessary to fall into the utopias and, above all, we must flee violence. Certainly, the government should take the cause of workers more seriously, providing work for the unemployed, protecting national industry, encouraging trade, but, George, how many things you would like to make this poor government do. But he does not want to take care of the interests of workers, and that is understandable. Caesar. How is this understood? It is true that, until now, the government has shown itself incapable and perhaps reluctant to provide a remedy for the country's ills, but tomorrow enlightened and zealous ministers could do what has not been done until now. George. No, dear sir, it is not a question of one ministry or another. It is a question of government in general, of all governments, those of today as well as those of yesterday, as well as those of tomorrow. The government comes from the owners, needs the support of the owners to sustain itself, its members are themselves owners. How then could he act in the interests of workers? On the other hand, the government, even if it wanted to, could not resolve the social question, because it depends on general causes which cannot be destroyed by a government and which, on the contrary, themselves determine the nature of the government and the path he follows. To resolve the social question, it is necessary to radically change the entire system that the government's mission is to defend. Are you talking about giving work to the unemployed? But what can the government do if it has no job? Should he have unnecessary work done? And who will pay them then? Should he produce to meet the unmet needs of the people? But then the owners would no longer be able to sell the products they usurp to the workers. Moreover, they should cease to be owners, because the government, in order to make the people work, would have to take away from them the land and the capital that they have monopolized. It would be the social revolution, the liquidation of the entire past, and you understand well that if the workers, the poor, the disinherited do not do it, the government will certainly never do it. Protect commerce and industry, you say? But the government can at most favor one class of industrialists at the expense of another, the traders of one region to the detriment of those of another, and there would therefore, ultimately, be nothing gained. But only a little favoritism, a little injustice and a lot of unproductive spending on top of that. And as for a government that would protect everyone, that is an absurd idea, since the government produces nothing and can, therefore, only displace the wealth produced by others. Caesar. But then, if the government cannot and will not do anything, what remedy is there? Even if you make a revolution, you will then have to appoint another government, and since you say that all governments are alike, we will be, after the revolution, at the same point as before. George. You would be right if the revolution we want was a simple change of government. But we want the complete transformation of the property regime, of the system of production and exchange. As for the government, a parasitic and harmful body, we absolutely do not want it. You already know I'm an anarchist, right? Anarchy means society without government. Caesar. But it's impossible. How would we live? Who would make the laws and who would enforce them? George. I can see that you have no idea what we want. In order not to waste our time on ramblings, you will have to let me explain to you briefly, but methodically, our program. We will then be able to discuss usefully. But it's getting late, we'll start next time. 3. Caesar. So, you will explain to us this evening how we can live without government. George. I will do my best. But first of all, let's take a look at how we find ourselves in today's society and whether it is really necessary to change its constitution. Observing the society in which we live, the first phenomena that strike us are the misery that afflicts the masses, the uncertainty of tomorrow which, more or less, weighs on us, the fierce struggle that everyone is waging against everyone for the conquest of bread. Ambroise. You could, my dear sir, continue for a long time to describe social evils. There is unfortunately no shortage of material. But that would be of no use and would in no way prove that we would be better off by turning everything upside down. It is not only misery that afflicts humanity, there is still the plague, cholera, earthquakes, and it would be curious if you wanted to make a revolution against these scourges. Evil is in the nature of things. George. But, I precisely want to show you that poverty depends on the current mode of social organization and that, in a more equitably and more reasonably organized society, it must disappear. When we do not know the cause of a problem and do not know how to remedy it, we must be patient, but, as soon as the remedy is discovered, it becomes the interest and duty of all to apply it. Ambroise. This is precisely your error. Misery depends on causes superior to human will and laws. Poverty depends on the miserly nature whose products cannot suffice for the needs of men. Look at animals, in which one cannot blame nefarious capital and tyrannical government, they only struggle for food and often die of starvation. When there is nothing, there is nothing. The truth is that there are too many of us on earth. Ah! If the people knew how to contain themselves and only had children when they could feed them. Have you read Malthus? George. Yes, a little. But, if I hadn't read it, it would amount to the same thing. What I know without needing to read it in any book is that it takes a famous forelock, excuse me for the term, to support such things. Poverty, you say, depends on nature, too stingy, and yet you know that there is a quantity of uncultivated land. Ambroise. But, if there is uncultivated land, it is because it is not cultivable or because it would not produce enough to pay for the cultivation costs. George. Do you believe? Try giving some as gifts to farmers and you will see what gardens they will make for you. Besides, are you really thinking seriously? Many of these lands were cultivated in the past, when the art of agriculture was in its infancy and when chemistry and mechanics applied to agriculture practically did not exist. Don't you know that today we can transform even pebbles into fertile land? Don't you know that agronomists, even the least enthusiastic, have calculated that a territory like Italy, cultivated rationally, could support a population of 100 million inhabitants in abundance? If the land is left uncultivated and only a small part of what others would give by less primitive cultivation methods is obtained, the real reason is that the owners have no interest in increasing production. They do not care about the well-being of the people, they produce to sell and know that when the material is abundant, the prices fall, the profit decreases until it becomes lower than that which they receive now that the products are insufficient and can be sold at whatever price they choose. This doesn't just happen for agricultural products. In all branches of human activity, it is the same thing. For example, in all cities, the poor are forced to live in filthy slums, crowded together without any regard for hygiene and morality and in conditions where it is impossible to keep themselves clean and live a life human. Why does this happen? Is it, perhaps, because there is a shortage of houses? But why not build healthy, convenient, and beautiful ones, and in sufficient numbers to shelter everyone? Stone, earth, bricks, lime, iron, wood, and all building materials abound. There are plenty of masons, carpenters, architects without work who would only ask to work. Why then do we leave inactive so many forces which could be used to the advantage of all? The reason is simple: if there were a lot of houses, rents would decrease. The owners of the houses that exist, and they are the same ones who would have the means to build others, have no desire to see their income reduced for the sake of poor people. Caesar. There is truth in what you say, but you are wrong in your explanation of the painful facts that afflict our country. If there is poorly cultivated or uncultivated land, a halt in business, general poverty, it is because our bourgeoisie is not enterprising. The capitalists are fearful or ignorant, and do not want or do not know how to develop industries. Landowners don't know how to do anything differently than their grandfathers did and don't want any hassle. Traders do not know how to open up new outlets, and the government, with its tax system and its stupid customs policy, instead of encouraging private initiatives, hinders them and stifles them in their cradle. Look at France, England, Germany. George. That our bourgeoisie is negligent and ignorant, I do not doubt it, but this inferiority explains, and only in part, why it is beaten by the bourgeoisies of other countries in the struggle to conquer the world market, but does not explain not the misery of the people. The proof is that poverty, unemployment, and all other social ills also exist in other countries where the bourgeoisie is active and intelligent. Moreover, these evils tend to increase in intensity with the development of industry, except in the case where the workers have been able, through organization, resistance, or uprisings, to achieve better living conditions. Capitalism is the same everywhere. He requires a permanent state of semi-starvation to live and prosper. He needs it to keep the prices of goods high and also to always find hungry people ready to work under any conditions. You see, in fact, that when, in a country, production is actively pushed, it is not to give producers the means to consume more, but always to sell on an external market. If local consumption increases, it is only when the workers have been able to take advantage of the circumstances to demand an increase in wages and have thus won the possibility of buying more. But then, when for one reason or another, the external market for whom we work, no longer buy anything, the crisis arises, work stops, wages fall, and abject poverty reappears. And yet, in the country itself, the majority of people lack everything, and yet it would be reasonable to work for one's own consumption. But then, what would the capitalists gain? Ambroise. So you believe that capitalism is all to blame? George. No doubt, or more generally to the fact that a few individuals have monopolized the land and all the instruments of production, and can impose their will on the workers, so that, instead of producing to satisfy the needs of the population and because of these needs are produced for the benefit of the bosses. All the reasons you can imagine, to save bourgeois privileges, are so many errors or so many lies. A moment ago, you said that the cause of poverty is the shortage of products. At another time, faced with the problem of the unemployed, you would have said that the stores are full, that the products are not selling and that the bosses cannot make people work and then throw away the products of work. And, in fact, such is the absurdity of the system, people die of hunger because the stores are full and there is no need to cultivate, or rather the owners do not need to cultivate the land, shoemakers don't work and therefore wear shoes with holes because there are too many shoes, and so on. Ambroise. It would therefore be the capitalists who should die of hunger. George. Certainly not. They should just work like everyone else. This will seem a bit harsh to you, but you wouldn't believe it, when you eat well, work isn't the devil. I could even show you that it is a need and a happiness for the human organism. But precisely. Tomorrow I have to work and it's already late. See you another time. 4. Caesar. I get real pleasure from reasoning with you. You have a way of presenting things that seems to prove you right, and I'm not saying you're wrong about everything. Absurdities, real or apparent, certainly exist in current social organization. One thing that is difficult to understand, for example, is customs. While, at home, the people are dying of hunger or of pellagra because there is not enough good bread, the government prevents the free entry into the country of American grains, a country where there is some more than is needed and where the owners only want to sell their harvest. It's like someone who, being hungry, would refuse to eat. Yet. George. Yes, but the government is not hungry, any more than the grain owners of Italy for whose interest the government places import duties on wheat. If those who are hungry were free, you would see if they would refuse grain. Caesar. I know it and I understand that with such arguments you succeed in persuading the people who see things broadly and from one side only, but in order not to be mistaken, it is necessary to examine the question from all angles. His faces, and that's what I was getting ready to do when you interrupted me. It is true that the interest of owners has a strong influence on the entry fees imposed on us. But, on the other hand, if the borders were open, the Americans who can produce wheat and meat with better conditions than us, would end up supplying our entire market, and then what would our farmers do? The owners would be ruined, but the workers' situation would be worse. Bread could sell for a penny, but the worker, if there was no way to earn that penny, would die of hunger just like before. And then, the Americans would like to receive the price, small or considerable, of their goods, and if, in Italy, nothing was produced, with what would we pay? You will tell me, perhaps, that in Italy we could cultivate the products for which the soil and climate are the most favorable and exchange them for those of other countries, wine, for example, oranges, flowers, and what do I know? But what if others don't want the things we can produce cheaply, either because they don't have the use for them, or because they produce them themselves? Not to mention that to transform culture you need capital, knowledge, and above all time. What would we eat in the meantime? George. But perfectly. You have hit the nail on the head. Free trade cannot, any more than protectionism, resolve the question of poverty. Free trade favors consumers and harms producers, and vice versa. Protectionism favors producers and harms consumers, so that for workers who are at the same time producers and consumers, protectionism or free trade, it is ultimately a white hat for a white hat. and it will always be the same, as long as we have not abolished the capitalist system. If the workers worked for their own account and not to make the bosses profit, each country would produce enough for its needs and would then only have to agree with the other countries to distribute the work according to the quality of the soil, the climate, the ease of obtaining raw materials, the dispositions of the inhabitants, etc. In this way, all men would obtain the maximum enjoyment with the minimum of effort. Caesar. Yes, but these are only beautiful dreams. George. These are dreams currently, but when the people understand that by this means we would live better, the dream will quickly transform into reality. There are no obstacles other than those opposed by the selfishness of some and the ignorance of others. Caesar. There are other obstacles, my dear. You imagine that, once the bosses are driven out, you will swim in opulence. George. I'm not saying that. On the contrary, I think that to escape the state of shortage in which capitalism keeps us and organize production in such a way as to largely satisfy the needs of all, it will be necessary to work and a lot. But it is not the will, but the possibility of working that the people lack. We complain about the current system not so much because we have to keep lazy people comfortable there, although that is far from pleasing us, as because it is these same idle people who regulate work and who prevent us from working in good conditions, to produce in abundance and for all. Caesar. You are exaggerating. It is true that owners often do not work in order to speculate on the shortage of products, but more often, it is because they themselves lack capital. Land and raw materials are not enough to produce. You know, you need the instruments, the machines, the premises, the means to pay the workers while they work, the capital, finally, and it only accumulates slowly. How many businesses remain in the planning stage, or, once started, go bankrupt for lack of capital? So think about what would happen if, as you seem to want, a social revolution occurred. With the destruction of capital and the nameless disorder that would result from it, you would only end up with general misery. George. This is another error or another lie of the defenders of the current order of things, the lack of capital. Capital may be lacking in this or that enterprise, because others have monopolized it, but in society in general, there is a lot of inactive capital, just as there is a lot of uncultivated land. Don't you see how many machines are rusting, how many factories remain closed, how many houses cannot find tenants? Workers must be fed while they work, but finally, these workers must also eat when they are unoccupied. They eat little and poorly, but they still live and are ready to work as soon as a boss needs them. So, it is not because the means of existence are lacking that these workers do not work, and if they could work for themselves, they would also accept, if it really became necessary, to work while living as they do. When they are unemployed, since they would know that this momentary sacrifice will bring them definitively out of their state of misery and subjection. Imagine, what has been seen many times, that an earthquake destroys a city, ruins an entire country. In a short time, the city was rebuilt more beautiful than before and no trace of the disaster remained in the region. As, in this case, the owners and the capitalists have an interest in putting people to work, the means are immediately found and an entire city is rebuilt in the blink of an eye where, previously, it had been said, for dozens of years, that there were no means to build a few workers' houses. Regarding the destruction of capital that would take place in times of revolution, it is to be hoped that in a conscious movement, made with the aim of pooling social wealth, the people will not want to destroy what will become their property. In any case, it will never do more harm than an earthquake. There will certainly be difficulties before things work out well. But of the serious obstacles that must be overcome to begin with, I see only two, the unconsciousness of the people and, the gendarmes. Ambroise. But, tell me, you are talking about capital, work, production, consumption, etc. But you never talk about law, morality, justice. The question of the best ways to use land and capital is very important, but even more important, because fundamental, are the moral questions. I too would like prosperity for all, but if, to achieve this utopia, we had to violate the moral law, deny the eternal principles of law on which every civilized society must be founded, oh then, I would prefer 1,000 times that the sufferings of today continued forever. And then, also think that there must be a supreme will which rules the world. The world did not make itself, and there must be an afterlife. I am not saying a God, a paradise, a hell, because you would be capable of not believing in it. There must be one beyond which explains everything, and in which the apparent injustices here below must find their compensation. Do you believe that you can violate the pre-established harmony of the universe? You can only, and we can only bow. So stop, once and for all, suborning the masses. Stop raising chimerical hopes in the souls of the disinherited. Stop blowing on the fire that only smolders too much under the ashes. Do you want, O modern barbarians, to destroy civilization, the glory of our fathers and our glory, in a terrible social cataclysm? If you wanted to do a useful work, if you wanted to alleviate as much as possible the sufferings of the miserable, tell them to resign themselves to their fate, because true happiness is to be content. Besides, everyone carries their cross, each class has its tribulations and its duties, and those who live in wealth are not always the happiest. George. Come, honorable magistrate, leave aside the declamations on the great principles and the conventional indignations. We are not here in court, and, for the moment, you have no sentence to pronounce against me. As, from hearing you, we can guess that you are not among the underprivileged. And the resignation of the miserable is so useful, to those who live on their backs. Above all, please leave aside the transcendent, religious arguments that you yourself do not believe. I know nothing about the mysteries of the universe, and you know no more, and that is why it is useless to bring them up for discussion. Moreover, be careful that belief in a supreme factor, in a God creator and father of men, would not be a very safe weapon for you. If the priests who have always been and still are in the service of the powerful, deduce for the poor the duty to resign themselves, another can deduce, and we find in the course of history someone who has deduced, the right to justice and equality. If God is our common Father, we are all brothers. God cannot want some of his sons to exploit and martyr others, and the rich, the rulers, would be Cains cursed by the Father. But let's leave it at that. Ambroise. Well, let's leave religion aside, because, with you, it would be useless to talk about it. But will you admit a law and a morality, a superior justice? George. Listen, if it were true that law, justice, morality require and sanction oppression and misfortune, even if only of a single human being, I would tell you right away that law, justice, morality are nothing but lies, infamous weapons forged for the defense of the privileged. And it is so when we hear these words as you hear them. Law, justice, morality must aim for the greatest possible good for all, otherwise they are synonymous with oppression and injustice, and it is so true that this conception responds to the necessity of the existence and development of human society, that it was formed and persists in the consciousness of man and strengthens itself in the opposite direction, despite all the efforts of those who, until now, have ruled in the world. But you yourself could not defend, except through poor sophisms, current social institutions by means of the principles of morality and justice, such as you understand them when you speak of them abstractly. Ambroise. You are really too presumptuous. It is not enough for you to deny, as you seem to me to do, the right to property. You still claim that we are incapable of defending it by our own principles. George. Precisely. If you want, I will demonstrate it to you next time. V. George. So, Mr. Judge, if I am not mistaken, we remained on the question of property rights. Ambroise. Indeed. And I am really curious to hear how you will manage to defend, in the name of justice and morality, your ideas of theft and plunder. A society where no one had the security of their property would cease to be a society and become a horde of wolves always ready to devour each other. George. Yet doesn't it seem to you that this is precisely the case of the society in which we live? You accuse us of wanting spoliation and plunder, but are it not, on the contrary, the owners who continually rob the workers and deprive them of the fruits of their labor? Ambroise. Owners use their property as they see fit, and they have the right to do so, just as workers freely use their hands. Bosses and workers freely negotiate the price of the work, and when the contract is not violated, no one has reason to complain. Charity can soften pain that is too acute and undeserved suffering, but the right must remain intangible. George. But, what are you talking to me about free contract? The worker is obliged to work in order not to die of hunger, and his freedom resembles that of the traveler who, attacked by thieves, gives his purse so that his life will not be taken. Ambroise. Let's admit. But that is not why you can deny the right of everyone to dispose of their property as they wish. George. His property, his property. But how and why can the landowner say that the land is his? And why and how does the capitalist allow himself to assert that the instruments of work and other capital created by human activity belong to him? Ambroise. The law recognizes his right to do so. George. Ah, if it were only the law, the highwayman might as well maintain that he has the right to murder and steal. He would only have to formulate some article of law which would recognize this right. And besides, this is precisely what the ruling classes did. They made the law both to legitimize the usurpations already perpetrated and to have a sure means of carrying out new ones. If all your supreme principles are based on codes, it is enough for tomorrow a law to decree the abolition of private property, for what you today call plunder and theft immediately become a supreme principle. Ambroise. Oh, but the law must be just. It must conform to the principles of law and morality and not be the effect of an unbridled whim, otherwise. George. So, it is not the law that creates the right, but the law that justifies the law. And then, by what right do all existing wealth, natural or created by work, belong to a few individuals who, by this fact, have the right of life and death over the mass of the disinherited? Ambroise. By virtue of the right that every man has and must have to freely dispose of the product of his activity. It is a feeling natural to man, without which no civilization would have been possible. George. Well, you have become a defender of labor rights. Bravo. But tell me, how is it then that those who work own nothing, while property is precisely the prerogative of those who do nothing? Isn't the logical consequence of your theory that the current owners are thieves? Does it not seem to you that in all justice we should expropriate them to return the wealth they usurp to the legitimate owners, the workers? Ambroise. If there are owners who do not work, it is because they or their ancestors worked before, and they had the wisdom to save and the talent to make their savings grow. George. Can you imagine a worker who, as a rule, barely earns enough to make ends meet, saving and accumulating wealth? You know well that the true origin of property is violence, plunder, legal or illegal theft. But let us admit, however, that a man has made savings on the product of his work, of his personal work, if he wants to enjoy it later when and how he sees fit, nothing better. But things completely change when what you call growing savings begins. This means making others work and stealing part of the product of their labor. It means hoarding goods and selling them for more than they cost. It means artificially creating famine to speculate on it. It means taking away from others the means to live by working freely, and then forcing them to work for little pay, and this means many other things of this kind, which no longer have any connection with the feeling of justice, but which clearly demonstrate that property, when it does not derive from frank and open theft, comes from the work of others, which the owners have, by one means or another, turned to their advantage. Does it seem fair to you that a man who has, through his labor and industry, I grant you, amassed a small amount of capital, can thereby steal from others the product of their labor? That, even more, he can bequeath to successive generations of his descendants the right to live idle lives at the expense of workers? It seems right to you that, a few active and thrifty men having amassed capital. I speak this way to echo your point, the great mass of humanity should be condemned to misery and stupidity in perpetuity. And, moreover, even if a man had worked solely by himself, with his own muscles and his own brain, without exploiting anyone, even if, against all possibility, he would have arrived like this, without the direct assistance or indirectly of the whole of society, to produce much more than is necessary for him, this man would not therefore be authorized to harm others, to take away their means of existence. Anyone who would build a road along the coast could not claim the right to deny others access to the sea. He who could single-handedly clear and cultivate the soil of a province could not claim to starve all the inhabitants. He who created new and powerful means of production would not have the right to use his invention in such a way as to subject men to his domination, and even less the right to dominate and exploit future generations. But what am I going to imagine if I assume, even for a moment, that the owners are workers or descendants of workers? Would you like me to tell you the origins of the fortune of the bigwigs of our commune, both the nobles of old stock and the rich of yesterday? Ambroise. No, please, let's not make personalities. If there is ill-gotten wealth, this is no reason to deny the right to property. The past is the past, there is no point in stirring up the original defects. George. Let's not move them, if you want. For me, the thing is of no importance. Individual property must be abolished, not because it may have been more or less poorly acquired, but because it gives the right and the means to exploit the labor of others, and because by developing it puts the mass of men under the dependence of a few. But, by the way, how will you justify individual ownership of land? There is no way to say that it results from the work of the owners, or their ancestors. Ambroise. Here. Waste land, barren, has no value. The man occupies it, fertilizes it, makes it fertile, and naturally has the right to the fruits that without his work it would not have produced. George. Very good, that is the right of the worker to the product of his work, but this right ceases when he ceases to cultivate the land. Doesn't it seem to you? Now, how is it that the current owners own territories that are often immense, that they do not work, that they have never worked, and that they do not even have others work? How come land that has never been cultivated is privately owned? What is the work, what are the improvements which are the origin of the right of property in similar cases? The truth is that, for land as for other wealth, the origin of property is violence. And you will only succeed in justifying it by admitting this principle: right is strength. And in this case, woe to you, if, one day, you are the weakest. Ambroise. But, ultimately, you lose sight of the social utility, the necessities inherent in society. Without property rights there would be no security, no order in work, and society would collapse into chaos. George. How do you now talk about social utility? But in our first conversations, I only concerned myself with the social ills caused by private property, and you reminded me of the question of abstract law. But let's finish it for this evening. Excuse me for having to withdraw. We will talk about it again. 6. George. Well, did you see what happened? Someone communicated our conversation the other day to a newspaper, and, for publishing it, this newspaper was seized. Ambroise. Oh. George. Parbleu. You don't know, that's for sure. I don't understand how you can claim to be right when you're so afraid that the public will hear your ideas discussed at all. In this newspaper your arguments and mine were faithfully reproduced. You should be happy that the public can appreciate the rational basis on which the current social order rests, and do justice to the vain criticisms of its adversaries. On the contrary, you seize, you shut people's mouths. Ambroise. But, I have nothing to do with it. I do not belong to the public prosecutor, I am a judge. George. Well, well. You are still colleagues, and the same spirit animates you all. If my chatter bores you, tell me. I'll go talk elsewhere. Ambroise. No. On the contrary, I will even confess to you that it interests me a lot. So let's continue. As for the seizure, I will have a word with the king's prosecutor. After all, according to the law as it stands, no one can deny you the right to discuss. George. So let's continue. The other day, if I remember correctly, you defended the right to property based firstly on positive law, that is to say the code, then on the feeling of justice, finally on social utility. Allow me to summarize my ideas on this subject in a few words. In my opinion, individual property is unjust and immoral because it originates either from brute force, or from fraud, or from the legal exploitation of the labor of others. It is harmful because it hinders production, because it prevents us from receiving from land and work everything that is necessary to satisfy the needs of all men. It is still harmful because it creates misery for the masses and generates hatred, crimes, and most of the ills that afflict modern society. This is why I would like it to be abolished and replaced by a regime of common property in which all men would receive, in return for a fair contribution in labor, the maximum possible well-being. Ambroise. But I really don't see how, logically, you arrive at communism. You fought against property because, according to you, it derives from violence and the exploitation of the labor of others. You said that capitalists regulate production with a view to their interests and not to best satisfy the needs of the public with the least effort of the workers. You have, more or less explicitly, denied the right to receive rent from land that one does not cultivate with one's own hands. You have further denied the right to lend your own money at interest or to profit from it by using it in the construction of houses or in other industries, but you have recognized the right of the worker to the product of his own labor. Even more, you have made yourself its defender. Consequently, strictly logically, you can demand the verification according to your ideas of property titles, the abolition of rent and interest on money. You can demand the liquidation of current society and the sharing of land and work tools among all those who want to use them. But you cannot speak of communism. Individual ownership of the products of personal labor must always exist, and if you want your emancipated worker to enjoy the security of tomorrow, without which only work giving an immediate result is done, you must also recognize individual ownership of land and instruments of production, at least while they are used. George. Very good. Keep going. It looks like you've reached socialism too. It's a different school from mine, but ultimately, it's still socialism. A socialist magistrate is an interesting phenomenon. Ambroise. No, nothing socialist. I only wanted to catch you in contradiction and prove to you that logically you had to be not a communist, but a sharer, a supporter of the sharing of goods, and then I would have told you that the splitting of property would make any large enterprise impossible and would produce general misery. George. But I am not in favor of sharing goods, any more than I know of any modern socialist. I do not believe that sharing goods would be worse than leaving them united in the hands of capitalists, but I know that this sharing, assuming it were possible, would cause serious damage to production. Furthermore, it would be unsustainable and would lead to the reconstitution of big fortunes and the proletariat, to poverty and excessive exploitation. I say that the worker has the right to the full product of his work, but I recognize that this right is only an abstract formula of justice. It means in practice that there must be no exploiters, that everyone must work and enjoy the fruits of labor according to the method agreed between them. The worker is not an isolated being in the world living by him, alone and for himself alone, but a sociable being who practices a continual exchange of services with other workers and who must coordinate his rights with those of all others. It is impossible, moreover, especially with modern methods of production, to determine, in a product, the exact part of the work that each of the workers provided. It is equally impossible to determine, in the difference in productivity of each worker or each group of workers, what part is due to the difference in skill and energy displayed by the workers and what part depends on the difference in soil fertility, the quality of the instruments used, the advantages or difficulties resulting from the situation or social environment. The solution cannot therefore be found in respecting the strict rights of each individual, We must seek it in fraternal agreement, in solidarity. Ambroise. But then freedom will no longer exist? George. On the contrary, only then will freedom exist. You, so-called liberals, call freedom the theoretical, abstract right to do a thing, and you would be able to say, without laughing and without blushing, that a man who died of hunger because he could not find food, was free to eat. We, on the contrary, call freedom the possibility of doing a thing, and this freedom, which is the only true one, becomes all the greater as good agreement between men progresses and as the help they provide increases. Give to each other. Ambroise. You said that if we divided the goods, the great fortunes would be reconstituted in the short term and that we would soon be at the same point as before the sharing. Why that? George. Because it would be, from the beginning, impossible to create a state of perfect equality for all. The lands differ enormously from each other, some produce a lot with little work, others produce little with a lot of work. Great are the advantages or disadvantages of all kinds that different localities offer, and great are the differences in physical and intellectual strength from man to man. Now, the moment of sharing would be the signal for rivalries and struggles. The best lands, the best instruments would go to the strongest, most intelligent, or most cunning men. The best means of production, therefore, being in the hands of the most gifted men, they would immediately be placed in a position much superior to that of the others. These privileged people, starting from these primitive advantages, would see their strength increase every day and would thus begin a new process of exploitation and expropriation of the weak, which would lead to the reconstitution of bourgeois society. Ambroise. But this could be prevented by means of good laws which would declare the shares of individuals inalienable and would surround the weak with a series of legal guarantees. George. Phew. You still believe that laws can fix everything? You are not a magistrate for nothing. Laws are made and undone according to the good pleasure of the strongest. Those who are a little stronger than the average man violate the laws, those who are much stronger repeal them and create others that serve their interests. Ambroise. So what? George. So, I have already told you, we must replace the struggle between men with agreement and solidarity, and to achieve this it is above all necessary to abolish individual property. Ambroise. Seriously, are you a communist? Everything is for everyone, whoever wants works, and whoever does not want makes love, eat, drink, have fun? What a land of plenty! What a beautiful life! Or what a madhouse! Ah! 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 George. Seeing the sad face you make by wanting to defend with reasoning this society governed solely by brutal force, it does not seem to me that you have much to laugh about. Yes, sir, I am a communist, but you seem to have a strange idea of communism. Next time, I will try to make this clear to you. For today, good evening. 7. Ambroise. Well, do you want to explain to us what your communism is? George. But willingly. Communism is a mode of social organization in which, instead of fighting among themselves to monopolize as much of the goods of this world as possible, and of exploiting and oppressing each other, as is the case in our society, men would associate and agree to ensure each of them the maximum possible well-being. Based on the principle that the land, mines, and all natural forces, as well as the accumulated products and acquisitions of all kinds of past generations belong to all, men, in communist society, would agree to work cooperatively to produce everything what they need. Ambroise. I understood. You want, as a cabbage leaf that I had in my hands during an anarchist trial said, that everyone produces according to their strength and consumes according to their needs, or let everyone give what they can and take what they need. Isn't that it? George. Indeed, these are maxims that we are used to repeating often, but we must understand them well to get an exact idea of what a communist society would be, as we understand it. It is obviously not a question of the absolute right that every man would have to satisfy all his needs, because needs are infinite, they increase more quickly than the means to satisfy them, and finally their satisfaction is always limited by the possibility of production. It would be neither useful nor just for the community to submit to work out of proportion to the utility produced, to satisfy the excessive needs, or to better say the whims of a few individuals. Nor is it a question of employing the entire individual forces for production, since that would mean, literally, working to the point of exhaustion, or that, to better satisfy the needs of man, one would have to destroy the man. We want everyone to be as well as possible, so that with the slightest expenditure of strength man can achieve the maximum satisfaction. To give you a theoretical formula which exactly represents such a state of affairs, I would not know, and I do not believe that it is possible today, but when the gendarmes and the bosses had cleared the floor, and the men considered themselves as brothers and thought about helping each other instead of exploiting each other, the practical formula for life would quickly be found. In each case, we would act as we knew and as we could, even if it meant modifying and improving as we learned to do better. Ambroise. I understand, you are in favor of taking the pile, as your French comrades say, everyone produces what they want and throws it into the pile, or, if you want, brings it to the common stores where everyone takes from the pile what they need or what they like. Is not it? George. I realize that you have decided to study the question somewhat, and I suppose that you have indulged in reading the documents of our trials more attentively than is generally done when it comes to sending us to prison. If magistrates and police officers started doing like you, what we steal from searches would at least be useful for something. But back to the question. This formula of taking from the pile is also only a way of saying which expresses our tendency to want to replace the mercantile spirit of today, the spirit of fraternity and solidarity, but this expression certainly does not indicate a concrete mode of social organization. Perhaps you will find some of our comrades who take this formula literally, because they suppose that work done spontaneously would always be superabundant and that the products would accumulate in such quantity and be so varied that it would be useless to impose any rules in work and consumption. But I don't think like that. I believe, as I told you, that man always has more needs than means to satisfy them, which rejoices me, because it is a cause of progress. I also believe that it would be a waste of strength to produce, even if it could, so to speak blindly, with the aim of providing for all possible needs, instead of calculating the actual and probable needs and organize yourself to satisfy them with as little fatigue as possible. So, once again, the solution lies in the agreement between men and in the understandings, expressed or tacit, to which they will arrive, when they have achieved equality of conditions and are inspired by the spirit of solidarity. Try to penetrate the spirit of our program and do not worry too much about formulas which, in our party as in all others, are only a concise and striking, but almost always vague and inaccurate, way of expressing a tendency. Ambroise. But don't you realize that communism is the negation of freedom, of human personality? Maybe he could have existed in the primitive times of humanity, when man, little developed intellectually and morally, was happy when he could satisfy, in the tribe, his material appetites. Perhaps it is possible in a religious, monastic society, which aims to suppress human passions, which boasts of absorbing the individual into the community, and makes obedience the first duty. But in modern society, in the flowering of civilization produced by free individual activity, with the need for independence and freedom which torments and ennobles modern man, communism, if it were not an impossible dream, would be a return to barbarism. All activity would be paralyzed, any emulation to distinguish oneself, to assert one's own individuality would be extinguished. George. And so on. Don't waste your eloquence. These are clichés that I have known for a long time, and so many sentences, so many lies, shameless or unconscious. The freedom, the individuality of the one who is dying of hunger. What a cruel irony! What profound hypocrisy! You defend a society where the vast majority of men live in the condition of brutes, a society where workers die of poverty and hunger, where children die by the thousands and millions for lack of care, where women prostitute themselves to have what to eat, a society where ignorance darkens minds, where even those who are educated must sell their knowledge and lie in order to feed themselves, a society where no one is sure of tomorrow and you dare to speak of freedom and individuality. Perhaps freedom and the possibility of developing one's own individuality exist for you, for a small caste of privileged people, and then again. The privileged themselves are victims of the state of struggle between man and man which spoils all social life and would benefit from living in a united society, free among free men, equal among equals. How can you properly maintain that solidarity is detrimental to freedom and the development of individuality? If we talked about family, and we will talk about it someday, you would not fail to sing one of your usual hymns in praise of this institution, base, etc., etc. Well, between the members of the family, at least the one that is glorified, not the one that really exists, love and solidarity reign. Will you maintain that brothers would be freer and would better develop their individuality if, instead of wishing each other well and working in common accord for the common good, they began to steal from each other, to beat, to hate each other, to beat each other with sticks? Ambroise. But ordering society like a family, organizing and running a communist society, this presupposes excessive centralization, an iron despotism, an omnipotent state. Imagine what oppressive power a government would have that had all the social wealth at its disposal and assigned to each person the work they would have to do and the share they could consume. George. Certainly, if communism were to be as you conceive it and as certain authoritarian school conceives it, it would be an impossible state or one which would resolve itself into a colossal and complicated tyranny and would necessarily provoke a great reaction. But none of this exists in the communism we want. We want free communism, anarchic if the word doesn't offend you. We want communism to be organized freely from the bottom up, starting with individuals uniting in associations, and continuing little by little with federations of associations, ever more complex, until they unite all of humanity in a single agreement of cooperation and solidarity. And as this communism will have been established freely, it must also be maintained freely by the will of those concerned. Ambroise. But for all this to be possible, all men would have to be angels, all of them should be altruists. And, on the contrary, man is by his nature selfish, wicked, hypocritical, lazy. George. Certainly, for communism to be possible, it is very necessary that, a little from the impulse of sociability and a little from a fair understanding of their interests, men, instead of hating each other, like to walk in harmony. Agreement and to help each other, but far from being an impossibility, it is already, today, a normal and general fact. The current social organization is a permanent cause of antagonisms and conflicts between classes and individuals, and if society can, despite this, maintain itself without literally degenerating into a horde of wolves devouring each other, it is precisely thanks to the profound human social instinct which provokes these thousand acts of solidarity, sympathy, devotion, of sacrifice that we make at every moment, without even thinking about it. This is what allows society to exist notwithstanding the causes of dissolution that it carries within it. Man is at the same time selfish and altruistic, it is in his very nature, in its biological, pre-social nature. If he had not been selfish, if he had not had the instinct for his own self-preservation, he could not have existed as an individual. If he had not been altruistic, if he had not had the instinct of sacrifice towards others, the first manifestation of which is love for offspring, he could not have existed as a species, nor even more so achieve social life. In today's society it is impossible to satisfy both the selfish feeling and the altruistic feeling coexisting in man, from which it follows that today no one is happy, not even those who occupy a privileged position. On the contrary, communism is the social form in which selfishness and altruism merge or tend to merge, and each man will accept it, because it will result in his happiness and that of others. Ambroise. I am willing, but do you believe that everyone will be willing and able to adapt to the duties imposed by a communist society? If, For example, some people didn't want to work. Yes, you arrange everything, in your imagination, as you please, and you will tell me that work is an organic need, a pleasure, and that everyone will compete to obtain as much of this as possible. Pleasure. George. I am not saying precisely that, although it is the opinion of many of my friends. For me, what is an organic need and a pleasure is movement, both muscular and nervous activity. But work is a disciplined activity with a view to achieving an objective goal external to the organism, and I understand very well that one may prefer a pleasant exercise, riding a horse, for example, when it would be necessary to plant cabbages. But I believe that man knows how to adapt and adapts very well to the conditions necessary to achieve the goal he pursues. As the products obtained by work are necessary to live and no one will have the means to force others to work for him, everyone will accept the necessity of working and will prefer the organization where the work will be, instead of time, the least painful and the most productive, the communist organization. Consider, furthermore, that in communism it is the workers themselves who organize and direct the work and that, therefore, they have every interest in making it pleasant and easy. Consider that in communist society, there would naturally be formed a public opinion which would condemn idleness as harmful to all, and remember that if even there existed idle people, they would only form an insignificant minority which could be complain and bear without significant damage to society. Ambroise. But suppose that, notwithstanding your optimistic forecasts, there are many idle people in your society. What will you do? Would you still maintain? So, it would be as well to maintain those whom you call bourgeois. George. In reality, there would be a difference, and a big one, since currently the bourgeoisie not only take part of what we produce from us, but they also prevent us from producing what we want and how we want. I am not saying that we should feed the idle if they become numerous enough to harm us, all the more so since idleness and the habit of living by I would give them the idea of commanding. Communism is a free pact, anyone who does not accept it or who, having accepted it, breaks it does not participate in it. Ambroise. But then, there would be a new class of underprivileged. George. Not at all. Everyone has the right to land, to the tools of work and to all the advantages that man can enjoy in the state of civilization to which humanity has arrived. If someone does not want to accept communist life and the obligations it implies, that is their business. He will arrange as he wishes with those who want to agree with him, and if he finds himself worse off than the others, that will prove to him the superiority of communism and push him to unite with the communists. Ambroise. Someone would therefore be free not to accept communism. George. Certainly, and he would have the same rights over natural wealth and products accumulated by past generations as the communists. What the hell? Haven't I always talked to you about free agreements, about free communism? How could there be a question of freedom if this alternative did not exist? Ambroise. So you don't want to impose your ideas by force? George. You are crazy. So you take us for gendarmes? Or for magistrates? Ambroise. Okay then. I don't see anything wrong with it. Everyone is free to dream as they wish. George. Be careful, however, not to misunderstand that defending oneself from thieves and violent people and reconquering one's rights is not imposing one's ideas. Ambroise. So to regain rights, you will use force, right? George. That's what I won't tell you. You could draw an indictment against us in some lawsuit. 1. But what I will tell you is that, as soon as the people are aware of their rights and want to put an end to them, you run the risk of being somewhat mistreated. But it all depends on the resistance you put up. If you give in with good grace, everything will go smoothly. If, on the contrary, you are obstinate, and I am convinced that you will be, too bad for you. Good evening. 1. We remind readers that these conversations were published in a newspaper which, to avoid seizures, had to make many things understood without saying them. 8. Ambroise. You know, the more I think about your free communism, the more I am convinced that you are a fine original. George. And why? Ambroise. Because you always talk about work, enjoyment, agreements, understandings, but you never say a word about social authority, about government. Who will regulate social life? Who will be the government? How will it be constituted? Who will elect him? What means will it have at its disposal to force compliance with its laws and to punish offenders? How will the different legislative, executive, and judicial powers be constituted? George. But with all these powers, we don't know what to do. We don't want a government. Don't you know yet that we are anarchists? Ambroise. When I told you that you are an original, I would still understand communism, and I admit that it could offer great advantages if everything were well organized by an enlightened government which would have the strength to impose respect for the law on everyone. But so, without government, without laws, what a waste that would be. George. I anticipated it. You were first of all against communism because, you said, it requires a centralized and strong government. Now that you hear about a society without a government, you are ready to accept communism, as long as there is a strong government. In short, it is freedom above all that frightens you. Ambroise. Which amounts to saying that to avoid one pitfall we will come up against the other. What is certain is that there cannot be a society without government. How do you expect things to work without rules, without standards of any kind? It would happen that, one pulling to the left, the other to the right, the boat would remain immobile, or rather that it would sink to the bottom. George. But I didn't tell you that I don't want rules or standards. I told you that I don't want a government, and by government I mean a power that makes the laws and imposes them on everyone. Ambroise. But if this government is elected by the people, it only represents the will of the people. What might you have to complain about? George. This is a lie. A generic, abstract popular will is only a metaphysical ideal. The people are made up of men, and men have 1,000 different wills varying according to the diversity of temperaments and circumstances, and wanting to obtain from them, by the magical virtue of the urn, a general will, common to all, is simply absurd. It would already be impossible for a single man to say to another, execute my will in all matters that may arise during a given time, because this man could not foresee what his will would be on different occasions. How then could a people entrust someone with carrying out their will, since, already at the moment of giving the mandate, the members of the community do not agree among themselves? Just think for a moment about the way elections are held, and be careful that I mean the way they would be held if all men were educated and independent, and if voting were perfectly conscious and free. You, for example, vote for the person you consider most capable of acting in accordance with your interests and implementing your ideas. This is already giving up a lot, since you have so many ideas and so many varied interests that you would not be able to find a man who thinks like you always and in everything. But will it be who you vote for who governs you? No way. First, your candidate may not be elected, and then your personal will no longer have any part in the so-called popular will. But suppose, if he is appointed, will he therefore be your ruler? Not even in a dream. It will only be one unit among many others, in the Italian parliament, for example, among 535, and you will, in reality, be governed by a majority of people to whom you will never have given any mandate. And this majority, whose members have received so many different or contradictory mandates, or better, who have only received a general delegation of power without a specific mandate, this majority, unable to realize a will general which does not exist and to satisfy everyone, will do as it sees fit, or will act as it pleases those who, momentarily, dominate it. Come on, it's better to leave aside this old fiction of the government representing the popular will. There are certainly questions of a general nature on which, at a given moment, all the people find themselves in agreement. But then, what is government for? If everyone agrees on the need to do something, they just have to do it. Ambroise. But, finally, you admitted that we need rules of life, standards. Who should establish them? George. The interested parties themselves, those who will have to follow these standards. Ambroise. And who will enforce respect? George. Nobody, since we are talking about freely accepted and freely followed standards. Do not confuse the norms that I am speaking to you about, which are practical conventions based on the feeling of solidarity and on the care that all must have for the collective interest, with the law, which is a rule prescribed by a few and imposed on all by force. We do not want law, but free pacts. Ambroise. What if someone violates the pact? George. Why would anyone violate it if it suits everyone? Moreover, if violations occurred, they would be a sign that not everyone is satisfied with the agreement and that it must be modified. And everyone would seek a better arrangement, because everyone is interested in ensuring that no one is unhappy. Ambroise. So you, it seems, dream of a primitive society in which everyone would do everything they need for themselves and where relationships between men would be few, restricted and elementary. George. But not at all. From the moment that the multiplicity and complexity of relationships provide men with greater moral and material satisfaction, we will seek to maintain relationships that are as numerous and as complex as possible. Ambroise. But then you will need to delegate functions, give responsibilities, appoint representatives to establish agreements. George. Certainly. But don't think this amounts to appointing a government. The government makes the law and imposes it, while in a free society, delegations are only specific, temporary charges to carry out indicated work, and do not give right to any authority or to any special compensation. And delegates' resolutions are always subject to the approval of their constituents. Ambroise. But you don't assume that everyone will agree. If there are people for whom your social order does not suit, what will you do? George. These people will arrange as they see fit and we will get along with them, so as not to cause each other trouble. Ambroise. But what if others want to annoy you? George. Then we will defend ourselves. Ambroise. Ah. But don't you see that from this need for defense a new government can be born? George. Certainly I see it, and this is precisely why I have always told you that anarchy will only be possible when the greatest causes of conflict have been eliminated, the agreement becoming of interest to all, the spirit of solidarity well developed among men. This is why, being an anarchist, I am also a communist. If you wanted to establish anarchy today, leaving intact individual property and the other social institutions which derive from it, there would immediately break out a civil war such that a government, however tyrannical, would be welcomed as a blessing. But if, at the same time as you establish anarchy, you abolish individual property, the causes of conflict that will remain will not be insurmountable and we will come to an agreement, because it will be to the advantage of all. Moreover, it is well understood that institutions are worth what the men who operate them are worth, and that anarchy especially, which is the reign of free agreement, cannot exist if men do not understand the benefits of solidarity. And do not want to agree. This is why we do propaganda. 9. Ambroise. Allow me to return to your anarchic communism. Honestly, I can't swallow it. George. Hey. I believe it. After having spent your life among the codes and the pandects, defending the rights of the state and that of the owners, a society without a state and without owners and in which there will no longer be either rebels or hungry to be sent to the galleys, such a society must seem to you like something from the other world. But if you want to ignore your position, if you have the strength to overcome your habits of mind and if you want to think about things without prejudice, you will easily understand that, admitting that the goal of society is to achieve the greatest good of all its members, anarchic communism is the solution to which we will necessarily arrive. If you think, on the contrary, that society exists to fatten a few people at the expense of everyone else, then Ambroise. No, no, I admit that society must aim for the general good, but I cannot accept your system for that. I am trying very hard to agree with your point of view, since I have taken an interest in the discussion and would at least like to have a clear idea of what you want. But your conclusions seem so utopian to me, so. George. But, in short, what is the point in the exposition that I have given you that you find obscure or unacceptable? Ambroise. That's. I don't know, the whole system. Let us leave aside the question of law on which we cannot agree, assuming that, as you argue, all have an equal right to enjoy existing wealth. I understand that communism seems to be the simplest and perhaps the best social order. But what does not seem absolutely possible to me is a society without government. You base your entire structure on the free will of the partners. George. Precisely. Ambroise. And that is your mistake. Society means hierarchy, discipline, submission of the individual to the community. Without authority there is no society possible. George. It is precisely the opposite. A society strictly speaking only exists between equals, and equals are in the habit of getting along with each other if it gives them pleasure and advantage, but not of subjugating one another. Your relationships of hierarchy and submission, which seem to you to be the essence of society, are relationships of slave and master, and you will admit, I hope, that the slave is not, strictly speaking, the partner of his master, any more than the domestic animal is the partner of the man to whom he belongs. Ambroise. But do you really believe a society where everyone does what they want is possible? George. Provided, of course, that men want to live in society and, consequently, adapt to the necessities of social life. Ambroise. But what if they don't want to? George. Then, there would be no society possible. But as man, at least modern man, can only find in society the satisfaction of his material and moral needs, it would be strange to suppose that he would want to renounce what is for him a condition of life and of well-being. Men find it difficult to agree when they discuss in the abstract. But is there something that needs to be done, that is in everyone's interest? Provided that no one has the means to impose their will on others and force them to act as they wish, obstinacy and self-esteem immediately disappear, we become conciliatory and the thing is accomplished. To the greatest satisfaction of all. This is understandable, nothing human is possible without the will of men. The whole problem for us is to change this will, that is to say to make men understand that by fighting each other, by hating each other, by exploiting each other, they all lose. And to persuade them to want a social organization based on mutual support and solidarity. Ambroise. So to establish your anarchic communism, you should wait until everyone is persuaded and has the will to establish it? George. Oh no. We would be pretty. The will is largely determined by the surrounding environment, and it is probable that as long as current conditions persist, the vast majority of men will continue to believe that society cannot be organized otherwise than it is. Ambroise. But then? George. Then, we ourselves will establish communism and anarchy among ourselves when there are sufficient numbers of us to do so, convinced that if others see that we are doing well, they will not delay in imitating us. Or if we cannot achieve communism and anarchy, we will work to change social conditions so as to determine wills in the direction we want. You understand, it is a reciprocal action of the environment on the will and of the will on the environment. We do and we will always do what we can to move us towards our ideal. What you must understand is that we do not want to violate anyone's will, but we do not want anyone to violate our will or that of the public. We revolt against this minority which, through violence, exploits and oppresses the people. Once freedom has been conquered for us and for all, and, of course, the means to remain free, namely to use the land and the instruments of production, we will no longer rely, to make our ideas triumph, only on force of word and example. Ambroise. This is very good, and you believe you will thus arrive at a society which will be governed simply by the concordant will of its members? It is indeed the case to say that this would be an unprecedented case. George. Not as much as you think. In reality, it has always been this way, if we consider that the vanquished, the enslaved, the beasts of burden and slaughter of human society are, strictly speaking, not part of it. In despotic states where all inhabitants are treated like a herd in the service of one, no one has a will except the sovereign, and those whom the sovereign needs to keep the mass enslaved. But as others manage to emancipate themselves and enter the dominant class, into society proper, either through direct participation in government or through the possession of wealth, society will become organized so as to satisfy the will of all the rulers. The entire legislative and executive apparatus, the entire government, with its laws, its soldiers, its police officers, its judges, etc., only serve to regularize and ensure the exploitation of the people. Otherwise, the bosses would find it simpler and more economical to agree among themselves and do without the state. The bourgeois themselves recognize this, when they forget, for a moment, that without the soldiers and the gendarmes, the people would come to disrupt the celebration. Abolish class divisions, ensure that there are no longer any slaves to keep in check, and immediately the state will no longer have any reason to exist. Moreover, even today, the essential part of social life, both in the dominant class and in the enslaved class, is accomplished by spontaneous and often unconscious agreements between individuals, out of habit, a point of honor, respect for the word given, fear of public opinion, feelings of honesty, love, sympathy, rules of politeness without any intervention from the law and the government. Law and government become necessary only when it comes to relations between dominators and enslaved. Among equals, everyone is ashamed to call the police and go to the judge. Ambroise. Let's see, don't exaggerate. The state, however, accomplishes things useful to everyone, provides education, ensures public health, defends the lives of citizens, organizes public services. You will not say that these are useless or harmful things. George. Oh, do as the state usually does, one could almost say. It is certain that the one who really accomplishes these tasks is always the worker, and the state, by setting itself up as regulator, only transforms them into instruments of domination and turns them to the special advantage of those who govern and owners. Education spreads if there is a desire among the public to learn and if there are teachers capable of instructing. Public health flourishes when the public knows, appreciates, and can put into practice the rules of hygiene, and when there are doctors capable of giving good advice to people. The lives of citizens are safe when men are accustomed to considering life and human freedom as sacred, and when there are neither judges nor police officers to set an example of brutality. Public services are organized when the need arises. The state creates nothing. In the best case scenario, it would only be a superfluous cog, a useless waste of forces. What if it was only useless? Ambroise. Enough. I think you've told me enough, I want to think about it. Bye. X. Lewis, worker. I knew that the social question was discussed here in the evening, and I came to address a request to my friend Georges. Tell me, is it true that you anarchists would like there to be no more police? George. Certainly. What? Are you not of this opinion? Since when did you become friends with the police and gendarmes? Lewis. I am not their friend, you know that, but I am no more the friend of thieves and murderers. I want my property and my life to be guarded, and well guarded. George. And who guards you from guards? Do you believe that men become thieves and murderers without cause? Is the best way to provide for our security to put a group of people on our backs who, under the pretext of defending us, oppress us and hold us to ransom, and do 1,000 times more harm than all the thieves and murderers together? Or would it not be better to destroy the causes of evil, ensuring that all can live without snatching bread from each other's mouths and that all can educate themselves and develop in ways that should be banished from the human heart the fatal passions of jealousy, hatred, and revenge. Lewis. But what? Men are bad by nature, and if there were not laws, judges, and gendarmes to keep us in check, worse than wolves, we would devour each other. George. If this were so, it would be one more reason not to give anyone the power to command and dispose of the freedom of others. Forced to fight against everyone, each by our own strength, we would know how to run the risk of the struggle, we could be from time to time either victorious or defeated, we would be savages, but we would at least enjoy the relative freedom of the forests and the harsh emotions of the beast of prey. But if we voluntarily gave some the right and the power to impose their will on us, precisely, according to you, because we are men predisposed to devour each other, it would be like devoting ourselves to the slavery and poverty. But you are wrong, my friend, men are good or bad depending on the circumstances. What is common to all is the instinct for self-preservation, the aspiration for well-being and the development of their own faculties. As long as to live well, one must harm others, only a small number resist, and with great effort, the temptation. But ensure that men find in the society of their fellow men the conditions for their well-being and their development, and there will be as much difficulty in being bad as there is today in being good. Lewis. Let's admit. But nevertheless, while awaiting social transformation, the police prevent crimes. George. Prevented. Lewis. Finally, it prevents a large number of them and delivers to justice the perpetrators of those it was unable to prevent. George. This is also not true. The influence of the police on the number and importance of crimes is almost zero. Indeed, whatever the reforms in the organization of the judiciary, the police, and the prisons, whether we increase or decrease the number of police officers, as long as the economic and moral conditions of the people do not change, crime remains essentially the same. On the contrary, all it takes is the slightest modification in the relationship between owners and workers, the slightest change in the price of wheat and other basic foodstuffs, or a crisis leaving workers without work, or the propaganda of an idea which opens new horizons to the people and brings them the smile of new hopes, so that an immediate increase or decrease in crime is visibly the effect. It is true that the police send delinquents to prison when they can get their hands on them, but since this does not serve to prevent new crimes, it is evil added to evil, one more suffering needlessly inflicted on people. Human being. And if even a few crimes were avoided by police action, this would be far from enough to compensate for those it provokes and the annoyance it imposes on the public. Their very function puts the police in combat against the entire public, makes them suspect to everyone, in fact like manhunters, induces them to put their self-esteem in the discovery of good cases of crime, and creates in them a special mentality that very often ends up developing absolutely antisocial instincts. It is not uncommon for a police officer, whose mission should be to prevent crime or to discover it, to provoke it, on the contrary, or to invent it in the interest of his career and to give himself importance and make yourself necessary. Lewis. But then the police would themselves be criminals. This can happen sometimes, especially since police personnel are not always recruited from the prime of the population, but in general. George. In general, the environment acts inexorably, and professional deformation even affects those who would be called upon to do better. Tell me then what can be or what can become the mentality of a man who obliges himself, by the salary he receives, to pursue, arrest, torment, anyone indicated to him by his superiors, without worry about whether he is dealing with a guilty or an innocent, a bandit or an apostle. Lewis. Yes, but. George. But let me say a few words to you on the most important point of the question, that is to say on what are the alleged misdeeds which the police are responsible for preventing and repressing. Certainly, among the acts punished by the code, there are some which are and will always be bad actions, but they are the exception and result from the state of stupefaction and despair to which poverty reduces men. But, in general, The acts punished are those which infringe on the privileges that the rich have granted themselves and those which attack the government in the exercise of its authority. So the police, effective or not, are intended to protect not society as a whole, but the privileged, and to keep the people submissive. You were talking about thieves? But who is a greater thief than the owner who enriches himself by stealing the product of the workers' labor? You were talking about assassins. But who is more murderous than the capitalists who, in order to maintain the privilege of commanding and living idle, are the cause of the atrocious deprivations and premature deaths of millions of workers, not to mention the continual slaughter of children? These thieves and murderers, much more guilty and more dangerous than the unfortunate people driven to crime by the miserable conditions in which they live, the police never touch them, far from it. Lewis. In short, you believe that once the revolution is complete, men will suddenly become, point blank, so many little saints. They will respect each other's rights, they will love and help each other, there will be no more hatred or jealousy, earthly paradise, what? George. In no way. I do not believe that moral transformations occur suddenly, point blank. There will, of course, be a great change simply by the fact of assured bread and conquered freedom, but all the evil passions which have been incarnated in us by the centuries-old action of slavery and the struggle of each against all will not suddenly disappear. For a long time to come, there will be people who will feel tempted to impose their own will on others by violence, or who will want to take advantage of favorable circumstances to create privileges for themselves, or who will retain for work this aversion which is inspired in them by the conditions of slavery in which they are today forced to work, etc. Lewis. So, even after the revolution, we will have to defend ourselves against evildoers. George. Very likely. Of course, we will then consider as evildoers not those who do not intend to die of hunger without revolting, and even less those who attack the current social organization and claim to substitute a better order, but those who will harm everyone. Those who attack the integrity of the individual, the freedom and well-being of others. Lewis. Good. So you will always need a policy. George. But not at all. It would really be a great folly if, to guard against some violent, some lazy, and some degenerate, we opened a school of laziness and violence by constituting a body of bandits who get used to considering citizens as fodder for handcuffs and prison and make manhunting their main or even their only occupation. Lewis. But then? George. Then we will defend ourselves. Lewis. And you think this is possible? George. Not only do I believe it is possible for the people to defend themselves, without delegating the special functions of social defense to anyone, but I am convinced that this is the only effective way. Tell me a little. If tomorrow a man wanted by the police comes to your house, will you go and denounce him? Lewis. But, are you crazy? Not even if he was the worst murderer. Do you take me for a snitch? George. It must be a very nasty job to be a policeman if any self-respecting man would feel dishonored in doing it, even if he believed it to be necessary to society. And now tell me one more thing. If someone was sick with an infectious disease or someone was raving mad, would you take them to the hospital? Lewis. Certainly. George. Even by force? Lewis. But, you must understand. Letting him go free could hurt so many people. George. Now, can you explain to me why you would be careful not to denounce a murderer, whereas you would take a madman or a plague victim to the hospital, even by force? Lewis. But, firstly because I am loath to act as a policeman, whereas I find it honorable and humanitarian to act as a nurse. George. So you see that the first effect of the police is to disinterest citizens in social defense and even to put them on the side of those whom, rightly or wrongly, they persecute. Lewis. And then, when I take someone to the hospital, I know that I am leaving them in the hands of the doctors, who will seek to cure them and release them as soon as they become harmless to their fellow human beings. and if he is incurable, they will seek to ease his suffering and will never inflict harsher treatment on him than is strictly necessary. And if doctors did not do their duty, the public would force them to do so, because it is understood that we keep people in the hospital to treat them and not to torture them. Whereas, on the contrary, if we put a man in the hands of the police, they put their self-esteem into having him convicted without caring much if he is guilty or innocent, then they put him in a prison where, instead of seeking to improve him through affectionate care, they do everything to make him suffer and exasperate him, and they release him, a more dangerous enemy to society than he was when he entered. But this could be changed by radical reform. George. My dear friend, to reform or destroy an institution, the first thing is not to form a corporation interested in preserving it. The police, and what is said about them also applies to the judiciary, by doing the job of sending people to prison and massacring them on occasion, always ends up feeling and being in struggle with the public. She pursues the delinquent, real or supposed, with the passion of the hunter pursuing the game, but at the same time, she is interested in their being delinquents, because they are her reason for being, and the more their numbers grow and the more dangerous they are, the more the power and social importance of the police increases. For the crime to be dealt with in a rational manner, for its causes to be sought and truly to be done to eliminate it, this task must be entrusted to those who are exposed to suffering its consequences of crime, that is to say to all the people, and not to those for whom the existence of crime is a source of power and gain. Lewis. Hey. It could be that you are right. By 11. Ambroise. I have thought about what you told me in our conversations, and I am giving up discussing it. Not that I confess myself defeated, but, in short, you have your reasons and the future could well be for you. In the meantime, I am a magistrate, and as long as the law is there, I must respect it and ensure it is respected. You understand? George. Oh, I understand very well. Just do. It will be our business to abolish the law and thus free you from the obligation to act against your conscience. Ambroise. Slowly, gently, I didn't say that, but let's move on. I would like some other explanation from you. We may perhaps be able to agree on questions concerning the regime of property and political organization. After all, these are historical forms that have changed many times and perhaps will change again. But there are sacred institutions, deep feelings of the human soul that you continually hurt, the family, the homeland. For example, you want to put everything in common. Naturally, you will also pool the women and thus create a great seraglio, isn't it true? George. Listen, if you want to argue with me, please do me the favor of not talking nonsense and not making bad comments. The issue we are dealing with is too serious to pepper it with vulgar nonsense. Ambroise. But I was speaking seriously. What will you do with the women? George. So too bad for you, because it's really strange that you don't understand the absurdity of what you said. Bring women together. And why don't you say that we want to bring people together? The only thing that can explain your conception is that, through inveterate habit, you consider woman as an inferior being, created and brought into the world to serve as a domestic animal and instrument of pleasure for the male. You count it as one thing and you suppose that the destiny of things must be assigned to it. But we, who consider women as human beings similar to us and who should enjoy all the rights and all the means of existence that the male sex enjoys or should enjoy, we simply find meaningless the question, what will you do? Do you have women? Ask instead, what will women do? And I will answer you that they will do what they want, and that, since they, like men, need to live in society, it is certain that they will want to get along with their peers, males and females, to satisfy their needs to the greatest advantage of themselves and of all. Ambroise. I understand, you consider women to be equal to men. However, many scientists, after examining the anatomical structure and physiological functions of the female organism, maintain that women are naturally inferior to men. George. Hey. Don't we know that, whatever the thing to support, we will always find a scholar for it? There are scholars who admit the inferiority of women, others, on the contrary, maintain that their faculties and their capacity for development are equivalent to those of men, and that if, today, women are generally less intelligent than men, this depends on the education they receive and the environment in which they live. If you look carefully, you will also find scholars, or, at least, female scholars, who declare that man is an inferior being intended to free woman from material work in order to leave her to her genital vocations. I know that this thesis has been defended in America. But whatever. This is not about solving a scientific problem, but about realizing a wish, a human ideal. Give women all the means and all the freedom to develop, only what can result will result. Will the woman be the equal of the man? Will she be more intelligent or less intelligent than him? This is what the facts will demonstrate. Science, moreover, will benefit from the experience, since it will then have positive facts on which to base its inductions. Ambroise. So you don't take into consideration the natural faculties of individuals? George. Not in the sense that they must create rights. In nature you will not find two equal individuals, but we demand social equality for all, that is to say the same means, the same conditions, and we believe that this equality not only responds to the feeling of justice and fraternity which has developed in humanity, but also turns to the real advantage of all, strong or weak. Among men too, among males, some are more intelligent, others less, but we do not therefore admit that some must have more rights than others. Some argue that blondes are better gifted than brunettes or vice versa, that breeds with oblong skulls are superior to those with broad skulls or vice versa, and the question, if it has a rational basis, is certainly interesting for science, but, given the current state of human feelings and ideals, it would be absurd to claim that the blonde and the dolichocephalic must command the brown and the dark-haired. Brachycephalic or vice versa. Isn't that your opinion? Ambroise. Okay. But let's return to the question of family. Do you want to abolish it or organize it on another basis? George. Here it is. In the family it is necessary to consider economic relations, sexual relations, and relations between children and parents. As an economic institution, it is clear that the family will no longer have any reason to exist and will in fact disappear, as soon as individual property and, consequently, inheritance are abolished. In this sense, moreover, the family is already abolished for the vast majority of the population, made up of proletarians. Ambroise. And for sexual relations. You want free love. George. Come on then. Do you believe that there can be a slave love? You will find forced cohabitation, feigned love, by force, by interest, or by social convenience. There will even be men and women who respect the matrimonial bond out of religious or moral conviction, but true love cannot exist, cannot be conceived, unless it is perfectly free. Ambroise. It's true, but if everyone followed the whims that the God of love inspires in them, there would no longer be morality and the world would become a brothel. George. In terms of morality, you can really boast of the results of your institutions. Adultery, lies of all kinds, long-simmering hatreds, husbands who kill their wives, women who poison their husbands, infanticide, children who grow up among scandals, family quarrels. Is this morality? That you believe is threatened by the freedom of love? Today, the world is truly a brothel, because women are frequently forced to prostitute themselves to live, because marriage, often contracted out of pure calculation of interest, is always for its entire duration a union in which love does not enter at all or enters only as an accessory. Ensure everyone has the means to live in a decent and independent manner, give women complete freedom to dispose of their person, destroy religious or other prejudices which constrain men and women to all kinds of convenience deriving from servitude and perpetuating it, and sexual unions will be made of love, will last as long as love lasts, and will only produce the happiness of the individual and the good of the species. Ambroise. But, finally, are you in favor of perpetual unions or temporary unions? Do you want separated couples or the multiplicity and variety of sexual relationships or even complete promiscuity? George. We want freedom. Until now, sexual unions have been so subjected to the pressure of brutal violence, economic necessity, religious prejudices and legal prescriptions that it is not possible to deduce which mode of sexual relations will respond best for the physical and moral good of the individual and the species. It is certain that once the conditions which, today, make relationships between men and women artificial and forced, have been eliminated, a sexual hygiene and morality will be established which will be respected, not because they are legal, but through conviction, based on experience, that they satisfy the good of individuals and the species. But this can only be the effect of freedom. Ambroise. And the children? George. You understand that, with common property accepted and the principle of social solidarity established on solid moral and material foundations, the maintenance of children will belong to the community and their education will be the care and interest of all. It is probable that all men and women will love all children, and if, as I certainly believe, parents have a special affection for those born to them, they will only have to rejoice in knowing that the future of their children is assured and that they have the support of the whole of society for their maintenance and education. Ambroise. But do you at least respect the rights of parents over their children? George. The right to children is made up of duties, has more rights over them, that is, rights to guide and care for them, who loves them best and takes care of them most, as, usually, parents love their own children best than those of others. It is also to them that the right to provide for their needs will primarily belong. And, on this subject, there is no need to fear disputes, because if some unnatural father loves his children little and does not take care of them, he will be happy that others take care of them and get rid of them. But if, by the right of the father over his children, you mean the right to mistreat them, to corrupt them, to exploit them, I absolutely deny this right, and I believe that no society worthy of the name would recognize it, and would not suffer it. Ambroise. But you don't think that this way of entrusting responsibility for the maintenance of children to the community would cause such an increase in the population that there would no longer be enough to live on for everyone? And you don't want to hear about Malthusianism, which you call an absurd thing. George. I told you previously that it is absurd to claim that current misery depends on the excess of the population and to want to remedy it through Malthusian practices. But I readily recognize the seriousness of the population question, and I admit that in the future, when all the children who will be born will have their maintenance assured, poverty could resurface due to a real excess of population. Emancipated and educated men will think, when they deem it necessary, to put a limit to the too rapid multiplication of the species, and I add that they will only think seriously about it when the monopolization, the privileges, the obstacles put to production by the greed of the owners have been destroyed, when all the social causes of misery have disappeared. Only then will the necessity to proportion the number of living things to the possibility of production, and the space available, will appear to everyone, simple and obvious. Ambroise. But if men don't want to think about it? George. So too bad for them. You do not want to understand that there is no divine or natural providence that takes care of the good of men. It is necessary for men to take care of their own good, doing what they find useful and necessary to achieve the goal. You always say, but what if they don't want it? In this case, they will achieve nothing and will always remain prey to the blind forces that surround them. It is the same today. Men do not know what to do to become free, or, if they do, they do not want to do it. This is why they remain slaves. But we hope they'll know and want it sooner than you think. Then they will be free. 12. Ambroise. You concluded the other day that the whole question is about wanting. If men want to be free, you said, if they want to do what it takes to live in a society of equals, everything will be fine, otherwise too bad for them. It would be very good if everyone wanted the same thing, but if some want to live in anarchy, while others prefer the tutelage of a government, if some are willing to take into consideration the needs of the community and others to enjoy the benefits of social life without adapting to its necessities, if they want to act in their own way without worrying about the damage that may result for others, how will you do it without a government that determines and imposes social duties? George. If there is a government, it is the will of those who govern, of their party, of their co-interested parties that triumphs, and the problem, which is to satisfy the will of all, is not resolved. On the contrary, the difficulty is aggravated. The faction that governs not only can ignore or violate the will of others by its own means, but it can use the force of all to impose itself. This is the case of current society, where the working class provides the government with the soldiers and the wealth which serves to keep the workers enslaved. I believe I have already told you, we want a society where everyone has the possibility of living as they wish, but where no man can force others to work for him and submit others to his own will. Once these two principles have been applied, freedom for all and instruments of production for all, the rest flows naturally, by force of circumstances, and the new society is organized in the way that best suits the general interest. Ambroise. What if a few want to impose themselves by brutal force? George. Then it would be the government or the aspiring rulers, and we would fight them by force. You understand well that if we want to make revolution today, it is not in order to submit docilely to new oppressors tomorrow. If they triumphed, the revolution would be defeated and it would have to be started again. Ambroise. But nevertheless, you will admit many moral principles superior to the will, to the caprice of men, and to which all are obliged to conform, at least theoretically. George. Oh. What then is this morality superior to the will of men? By whom is it prescribed? Where does it derive from? Morality varies according to times, countries, classes, circumstances. It expresses what men consider to be the best course of action at a certain moment, in given circumstances. In short, for each individual, what is consistent with good morality is what is good for them, what pleases them for practical or sentimental reasons. For you, morality enjoins respect for the law, that is to say submission to the privileges enjoyed by your class. For us, it requires revolt against oppression and the search for the good of all. We believe that all moral prescriptions are summed up in love between men. Ambroise. And the delinquents? Will you respect their freedom? George. For us, being delinquent means violating the freedom of others. When the delinquents have been numerous and powerful, and have organized their domination in a stable manner, as is the case today with owners and rulers, a revolution is necessary to free ourselves from them. When, on the contrary, the offenders are a few maladjusted or sick individuals, we will seek to discover the causes of their condition and provide appropriate remedies. Ambroise. But then? We would therefore need a judiciary, a penal code, a police force, prisons, etc. George. And therefore, you will say, the reconstitution of a government, the return to the state of oppression where we are today. Indeed, the greatest damage caused by the offense is not so much the isolated and transitory fact of the violation of the right of any individual, as the danger of seeing it serve as an occasion and pretext for the constitution of an authority which, under the appearance of defending society, subjugates and oppresses it. We already know what the police and the judiciary are for, and that they are the source rather than the remedy for countless crimes. We must therefore seek to destroy the crime by eliminating its causes, and if even a residue of delinquents remained, the community, directly interested, should think about making it impossible for them to do harm without delegating to anyone the specific function of prosecuting criminals. Do you know the fable of the horse which asked man for protection and had to carry him on its back? Ambroise. This is going well. Besides, I speak to find out and not to discuss. Something else. Given that, in your society, all are socially equal, all have the right to the same means of education and development, all have full freedom to choose their own path, how will you go about providing for all the necessary work? There are pleasant and painful, healthy and unhealthy. Naturally, everyone would choose the best works. Who would do the others, often the most necessary? And then there is the great division between workers. Intellectuals and manual workers. Does it not seem to you that everyone will want to be writers, doctors, poets, and that no one will want to cultivate the land, make shoes, etc.? So what? George. It is obvious that you want to foresee the society of the future, a society of equality, freedom, and above all solidarity and free agreement, assuming the persistence of the moral and material conditions of today. This is impossible. When all had the means, all would achieve the greatest physical and intellectual development that their natural faculties would allow, all would be initiated into intellectual joys and productive work, the mind and body would develop harmoniously, all to varying degrees, according to tastes and abilities, would be learned and literate and all would be workers. What would happen then? Imagine that a few thousand doctors, engineers, scholars, artists were transported to a vast and fertile island, provided with work tools and left to their own devices. Do you believe that they would starve themselves to death rather than work with their hands, and that they would massacre each other rather than agree and divide the work according to their tastes and abilities? If there were jobs that none of them liked to do, they would do them in turns and all would look for ways to make the unhealthy and hard work healthy and enjoyable. Ambroise. That's good, that's good. I would have 1,000 other requests to address to you, but you wander in the middle of utopia and you find, in your imagination, the way to solve all the problems. I would prefer that you tell me a little about the ways and means to make your dreams come true. George. Very willingly, especially since, in my opinion, if the ideal is necessary as a beacon that indicates the supreme goal, nevertheless the urgent question is what must be done today and in the nearest future. We'll talk about it next time. 13. Ambroise. So, this evening we will talk about the means by which you propose to realize your ideal, of establishing anarchy. I can already imagine them. There will be bombs, massacres, summary executions, and then looting, fires and other delights. George. My dear sir, you have the wrong address. You think you are speaking to one of these officers who command European soldiers when they go to civilize Africa or Asia or when they civilize among themselves in Europe. I'm not in that category, please believe me. Caesar. I think, Mr. President, that our friend, who, in short, shows himself to be a reasonable young man although a little too prone to dreams, expects the triumph of the ideas of the natural evolution of society, of the diffusion of education, the progress of science, the development of production. And after all, there is nothing wrong with it. If anarchy must come, it will come, and there is no point in racking your brains to avoid the inevitable. And then, it's all so distant. So let us live in peace. George. Certainly, there would really be no reason to be upset. But I don't count on evolution, science, etc. There would be too much to wait, and what's worse, we would wait in vain. Human evolution advances in the direction that the will of men pushes it, and there is no natural law which obliges evolution to inevitably lead to freedom rather than to the division of society into two permanent castes, we could almost say in two races, those who dominate and those who are dominated. Any social state, as long as it has found sufficient reasons to exist, can also persist indefinitely if the oppressors do not encounter conscious, active, aggressive resistance from the oppressed. The factors of dissolution and spontaneous death which exist in any regime, even if they do not find compensation and an antidote in other factors of recomposition and life, can always be neutralized by the know-how of those who have the social force and directs it as he pleases. I could demonstrate to you, if I were not afraid of taking too long, how the bourgeoisie remedies these natural tendencies from which some socialists expected its death in the short term. Science is a powerful weapon which can be used for evil as well as for good, and as in the present state of inequality it is more accessible to the privileged than to the oppressed, it is more useful to the former than to the oppressed. These education, at least that which goes further than a superficial and almost useless blur, is inaccessible to the underprivileged masses, and then, it too can be directed in the direction that the educators want, or rather those who choose and pay for it. Educators. Ambroise. But then, all that remains is violence? George. That is to say the revolution. Ambroise. The violent revolution, the armed revolution? George. Precisely. Ambroise. So the bombs. George. Let's not worry about that. You are a magistrate, and I do not like to have to repeat to you that here we are not in court, and that, at least for the moment, I am not an accused from whom it may be in your interest to extract a careless word. The revolution will be violent, because you, the ruling class, rely on violence and show no willingness to yield peacefully. There will therefore be shootings, cannonades, bombs, ethereal waves which will remotely explode your explosive depots and the cartridges in the pouches of your soldiers. There will be what there will be. These are technical questions that we will please leave to the technicians. What I can assure you is that, as much as it depends on us, the violence imposed on us by your violence will not exceed the strict limits assigned by the necessities of the struggle, which means that it will be determined above all by the resistance you put up against us. If something worse happens, the cause will be your obstinacy and the bloodthirsty education that your example gives to the people. Caesar. But how will you carry out this revolution, if you are 4 cats? George. It is possible that there are only 4 of us. It is pleasant for you to hope for it, and I do not want to take away such a sweet illusion. Let's say we strive to become 8 and then 16. Certainly our task, when we cannot do better, is to make the propaganda necessary to bring together a minority of conscious men who know what they have to do and are determined to do it. Our task is to prepare the mass, the largest possible mass, to act in the right direction when the opportunity presents itself. And by good direction we mean, expropriating the current holders of social wealth, overthrowing authority, preventing new privileges and new forms of government from being established, and reorganizing directly, through the action of workers, distribution, and all social life. Caesar. What if the opportunity doesn't present itself? George. Well, we will seek to give birth to it. Prosper. What illusions you have, my dear boy. You still think you're in the days of the flintlock rifle. With modern weapons and tactics, you would be massacred before you moved. George. This is not proven. To new weapons and tactics, we can oppose weapons and tactics of equal value. And then, these weapons are in the hands of the sons of the people, and by forcing them all into military service, you have taught them how to use them. You cannot imagine how powerless you will be the day a sufficient number of rebels want to do so. It is we, the proletarians, the oppressed class, who are the electricians and the gas workers. It is we who drive the locomotives, it is we who make the explosives and drill the mines, it is we who direct the automobiles and the airplanes. We are the soldiers, and it is us, alas, who defend you against ourselves. You only live by the unconscious will of your victims. Pay attention to the awakening of consciences. And then, you know, among us anarchists, everyone does what they want, and your police are used to looking everywhere, except in the direction where the danger really is. But, I don't intend to give you a lesson in insurrectional technique. That's a matter, which doesn't concern you. Good evening. 14. Vincent, young Republican. Would you allow me to take part in the conversation to ask a few questions and make some observations? Our friend Georges speaks of anarchy, but he says that anarchy must come freely, by the will of the people, without being imposed. He also says that to give free rein to the popular will, it is necessary to bring down through insurrection the monarchical and militarist regime which, today, stifles and distorts this will. But this is what the Republicans want, that is to say those who really intend to establish the Republic. Why doesn't our friend declare himself a Republican? In a republic, the people are sovereign. What happens is that the people want it, and if they want anarchy, there will be anarchy. George. I believe I never said will of the people, but will of men, or if I said it, it was a way of speaking, an inaccuracy of language which, moreover, all my words have corrected. Vincent. But, what do these questions of words mean? Are the people not made up of men? George. It's not a question of words, it's a question of substance. This is the difference between democracy, which means government by the people, and anarchy, which means absence of government, freedom for all. The people are certainly composed of men, that is to say, conscious units, interdependent as much as one wishes, but who have their own sensitivity and, consequently, particular interests, passions, wills, totalizing or eliminating each other in turn depending on the case, reinforcing or neutralizing each other. The stronger, better armed will of a man, of a party, of a class can dominate, impose itself, succeed in passing for the will of all, but in truth, what we usually call the will of the people is the will of those who dominate, or it is a hybrid product of numerical calculations which responds exactly to the will of no one and satisfies no one. By the very admission of the Democrats, that is to say the Republicans, because they are the only true Democrats, the so-called government of the people is only the government of the majority which expresses and realizes its will through its representatives. So the sovereignty of the minority is a simple nominal right which does not translate into reality, and note that this minority, in addition to being the most advanced part, the most capable of the progress of the population, can also be the numerical majority, when several disagreeing fractions find themselves in the presence of a compact minority by community of interests and ideas or by submission to a man who guides it. But is the party that succeeds in making its own candidates triumph and calls itself the self-governing majority really governed according to its own will? The functioning of the parliamentary system, necessary in any republic which is not a small independent and isolated commune, means that the representative of each group of the electorate is only one unit in a number and only counts for 100th or 1,000th in the making of these laws which should be the expression of the will of its voters. And now, let's put aside the question of whether the Republican regime can achieve the will of all and just tell me what your will is, what you would like the Republic to be and what social institutions it would have. Should achieve. Vincent. But, it's clear. What I want, what all true Republicans want, is social justice, the emancipation of workers, equality, liberty, fraternity. George. Well, like in France, Switzerland, and America. Vincent. These are not true republics. You must criticize the true republic, the one that we Republicans want, and not the various bourgeois, militarist, and clerical governments, which, in different parts of the world, take the name of republic. Otherwise, to combat socialism and anarchy, I too could cite to you all those who call themselves socialists and anarchists and are something completely different. George. Very good. But why then have the republics which exist not given rise to true republics? Why even, being all or almost all parties to this ideal of equality, liberty, and fraternity which is yours and I can also say ours, why have they become, and are becoming more every day, regimes of privilege, where the workers are as exploited and the capitalists as powerful, the people as oppressed and the government as prevaricating as under any monarchical regime? The political institutions, the regulatory bodies of society, the rights recognized to individuals and communities by the Constitution are what they would be in your republic. Why then were the consequences so bad, or at least so negative, and why would they be different in the republic that you would establish? Vincent. Because. George. The reason, I will tell you, it is that in these republics the economic conditions of the people remain essentially the same, the division of society into the owner class and the proletarian class remains, and the real power therefore remains in the hands of those who have a monopoly on the means of production and hold at will the great mass of the underprivileged. Naturally, the privileged class worked to consolidate its position, which may have been shaken by the revolutionary upheaval from which the Republic had emerged, and soon things returned to the way they had been before, except, perhaps, this progress which depends not on the form of government, but from the increased consciousness of the workers, from the greater confidence that the masses take in their own strength each time they succeed in bringing down a government. Vincent. But, we recognize the importance of the economic question. We would establish a progressive tax which would place the heaviest share of public costs on the shoulders of the rich. We would abolish protective customs. We would impose a tax on uncultivated land. We would establish a minimum wage and a maximum on prices. We would make laws to protect workers. George. And if you succeeded in doing all this, the capitalists would still find a way to make it useless or turn it to their advantage. Vincent. Well. Then we would expropriate them, and without compensation, and we would establish communism. Are you happy? George. No, no. Communism established by the will of the government and not by the direct and voluntary action of groups of workers really does not appeal to me. If it were possible, it would be the most stifling tyranny to which human society has ever been subjected. But you say, we would do this or that, as if, by the simple fact that you are yesterday's Republicans, you would be the government once the Republic was proclaimed. Now, since the Republic is the regime of what you call popular sovereignty, and this sovereignty is exercised by universal suffrage, the government would be composed of the men whom the suffrage would designate. And as you would not have broken at the very moment of the revolution the power of the capitalists by revolutionary expropriation, the first Republican Parliament would be what the capitalists wanted, or, if not the first which could feel a little of the revolutionary turmoil, at least the successive parliaments would be as the capitalists wanted them, and they would strive to destroy the little good that the revolution, by chance, could have done. Vincent. But then, since anarchy is not possible today, should we quietly tolerate monarchy for who knows how long? George. Not at all. Barely have circumstances become favorable to an insurrectional movement than you can count on our assistance, as we will ask for yours. Naturally, the scope that we will strive to give to this movement will be much wider than that which you would like to give it, but this does not prevent the common interest that we have today in shaking off the yoke which oppresses us like you. Then we'll see. In the meantime, let us carry out propaganda and seek to prepare the masses so that the next revolutionary movement results in as profound a social transformation as possible, and leaves open, wide, and easy, the path to new progress. 15. Caesar. Let's resume our usual conversation. It seems that for you what is of most immediate interest is the insurrection, and I admit that, however difficult it may seem, you can, in a near or distant day, provoke it and conquer it. In fact, governments rely on soldiers, and conscription soldiers, who go and stay in the barracks with reluctance and because they are forced to, are an insecure weapon. Faced with a general uprising of the people, the soldiers, who are also people, do not resist for long, and as soon as the prestige and fear of discipline are destroyed, they either disband, or they join the people. I therefore understand well that by doing a lot of propaganda among the workers, the soldiers, and the young people who tomorrow will be soldiers, you can put yourself in a position to take advantage of a favorable opportunity, economic crisis, unfortunate war, general strike, famine, etc., and bring down the government. But then? You will tell me, the people will act by themselves, organize, etc. But these are words. What will probably happen is that after a more or less long period of disorder, dissipation, and perhaps massacres, a new government will take the place of the old one, and everything will continue as before. Why then waste such energy? George. Even if it were to be as you say, the insurrection would nevertheless not have been useless, because, after a revolution, things never become exactly what they were before. The people enjoyed a period of freedom and experiences his strength, and it is not easy to make him accept the previous conditions again. The new government, if there is a government, feels that it could not remain in power securely if it did not provide some satisfaction, and usually, it seeks to justify its ascension, by taking the title of interpreter and continuator of the revolution. Naturally, the task that the government would actually give itself would be to prevent the revolution from going further and to restrict and alter, with the aim of domination, the conquests of this revolution, but it could not put things back in their primitive state. This is what happened in all past revolutions. However, we have reason to hope that in the next revolution we will do much better. Caesar. And why? George. Because in past revolutions, all the revolutionaries, all the initiators and main actors of the revolution wanted to transform society through laws and wanted a government that made and imposed these laws. It was therefore inevitable that we would end up with a new government, and it was natural that the new government would think above all about governing, that is to say, consolidating itself in power, and to do so forming a party around itself and a privileged class interested in its permanence in power. But now a new factor has appeared in history, the anarchists. Now there are revolutionaries who want to make revolution for clearly anti-government goals. The constitution of a new government would therefore find an obstacle that it has never found in the past. Moreover, the revolutionaries of the past, wanting to bring about social transformations, whatever they were, by means of laws, appealed to the masses only for the material assistance they had to provide, and did not take care of making them aware of what they should want and how to achieve their aspirations. So the people, good for destruction, naturally themselves demanded a government when it came to reorganizing ordinary social life. We tend, on the contrary, through our propaganda and through workers' organizations, to constitute a conscious minority which knows what it wants to do and which, mixed with the mass, can provide for immediate needs and take the initiatives that were expected formerly of the government. Caesar. Very good, but since you will only be a minority and in many parts of the country you will have no influence, a government will still be formed and you will have to endure it. George. That a government manages to be constituted is, in fact, very probable, but that we have to endure it, that is what we will see. Note this carefully: in the revolutions of the past, we focused primarily on creating a new government, and then, from this new government, we expected the new order. And, in the meantime, things remained essentially the same. Even the economic conditions of the masses were aggravated by the cessation of industries and commerce, hence the quickly occurring fatigue, the haste to end things, and the hostility of the public against those who wanted to prolong the insurrectional state. And this is how it happened that anyone who showed himself capable of restoring order, whether it was a happy soldier, a skillful and daring politician, or even the sovereign himself, first expelled, was acclaimed by the people as a peacemaker and a liberator. We understand the revolution in a different way. We want the social transformations towards which the revolution aims to begin to take place from the first insurrectional act. We want the people to immediately take possession of the existing wealth, to declare the palaces of the rich public domain, and to ensure, through the initiative of those who have the most goodwill and activity, that all the population is housed as poorly as possible, and immediately the builders' associations get involved in the construction of the new houses which will be deemed necessary. We want all available food products to be communalized, and, always with the help of goodwill and under the real control of the public, to organize equal distribution for all. We want farmers to take possession of uncultivated land, that of the big owners, and to convince themselves that these lands now belong to the workers. We want the workers to escape the direction of the bosses and continue production on their own for the public. We want exchange relations to be immediately established between the various producing associations and the various communes. And at the same time we want all material signs of individual property to be burned and destroyed. And state domination. We want, in short, from the first moment, to make the masses feel the benefits of the revolution and to disrupt things in such a way that it is impossible to re-establish the old order. Caesar. And does it seem to you that all this is so easy to do? George. No, I know well all the difficulties that will be encountered. I foresee that this program will not be able to be followed immediately everywhere, and that, where it is carried out, it will give rise to 1,000 frictions, to 1,000 errors. But the mere fact that there are men determined to apply it and who will try to apply it wherever possible is already a guarantee that henceforth the revolution can no longer be anything other than a simple political transformation, and that it must necessarily result in a profound transformation of all social life. Moreover, something similar, although in relatively small proportions, was done by the bourgeoisie during the Great French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, and the old regime was unable to re-establish itself despite the Empire and the Restoration. Caesar. But if, despite all your good or bad intentions, a government is formed, all your projects disappear and you too will have to submit to the laws like the others. George. And why? That a government or governments will be formed is, of course, very probable. There are so many people who want to command and even more who are willing to obey. But it is very difficult for this government to impose itself, be accepted and become a regular government, if there are enough revolutionaries in the country and if they have been able to interest the masses sufficiently to prevent a new government has the opportunity to become strong and stable. A government needs soldiers, and we will do everything possible to ensure that it does not have any. He needs money, and we will do everything possible so that no one pays taxes and no one gives him credit. There are communes and perhaps regions in Italy where the revolutionaries are numerous enough and the workers sufficiently prepared to proclaim themselves autonomous and take care of their own affairs, to refuse to recognize the government and to receive its agents, or to send their representatives to him. These regions, these communes will be centers of revolutionary influence against which any government will be powerless if we act quickly, and if we do not give it time to arm itself and consolidate itself. Caesar. But then it's civil war. George. Maybe so. We are for peace, we ardently desire peace, but we will not sacrifice the revolution to our desire for peace. We will not sacrifice it, because through it alone can true and permanent peace be achieved. 16. Philippe, disabled in war. I no longer care about it, and you will allow me to tell you that I am stunned, I would almost say indignant, to see that, having the most diverse opinions, you nevertheless seem to agree to ignore the essential question, that of the homeland, that of ensuring the greatness and glory of our Italy. Prosper, Cesar, Vincent and all those present, except Georges and Louis, a young socialist, loudly protest their love for Italy, and Ambroise said for all. In these conversations, we did not talk about Italy like we did not talk about our mothers. It was not useful to talk about what is understood, what is above all opinion, all discussion. I ask Philippe not to question our patriotism, not even that of Georges. George. Oh, but yes. You can very well doubt my patriotism, because I am not patriotic. Philip. Well, I suspected that. You are one of those who cry, "Down with Italy," and would like to see our country humiliated, defeated, dominated by foreigners. George. But not at all. These are the usual slanders with which we seek to deceive people and warn them against us. I know well that men of good faith believe these lies, but it is the fruit of ignorance and incomprehension. We do not want any kind of domination, and therefore we cannot want Italy to be dominated by other countries, just as we would not want it to dominate others. We consider the whole world as our homeland, all men as our brothers. It would therefore simply be absurd on our part to want humiliation and damage precisely to the country where we live, where our loved ones are, whose language we speak best, to the country which gives us the most and to which we give the most in the exchange of work, ideas, affections. Ambroise. But this country is the homeland that you constantly blaspheme. George. We do not blaspheme the homeland, any homeland. We blaspheme patriotism, what you call patriotism, which is national pride, preaching hatred against other countries, a pretext for launching people against people in homicidal wars for the benefit of shady capitalist interests and the excessive ambitions of sovereigns and politicians. Vincent. Slowly, gently. You are right if you speak of the patriotism of so many capitalists and so many royalists, for whom love of the homeland is really a pretext, and I despise and abhor like you those who risk nothing for the homeland and who, in the name of the homeland, enrich themselves at the expense of the sweat and blood of workers and sincere men of all classes. But there are men who are true patriots, who for the fatherland have sacrificed everything or are ready to sacrifice everything, good, freedom, life. You know that Republicans have always been inspired by the highest patriotism and that they have always paid for it personally. George. I always admire those who sacrifice themselves for their ideas, but that does not prevent me from understanding that the conceptions of Republicans and sincere patriots, which certainly exist in all parties, are now outdated and only serve to allow rulers and capitalists to mask their true goals with ideal motives and to lead the unconscious masses and enthusiastic youth. Vincent. But how outdated? Love for our own country is a natural feeling of the human heart and will never be surpassed. George. What you call love of our own country is attachment to the country where we have the strongest moral ties and also the greatest assurance of material well-being. It is certainly natural and will last forever, or at least until civilization has progressed to the point where every man actually finds his home in any country. But this has nothing in common with the homeland myth, which makes you consider other peoples as inferior and desire the predominance of your country over others, and which would make workers consider that they are closer to the bosses and henchmen their compatriots than foreign workers, with whom they have common interests and aspirations. Moreover, our feeling of internationalism, of cosmopolitanism, is only the development, the continuation of progress already made. You may feel particularly attached to your native village or your region for 1,000 sentimental or material reasons, without being a parochialist or regionalist. You brag about being Italian, and on occasion you put the general good of Italy above local and regional interests. If you find that expanding the homeland from the commune to the nation has been progress, why stop there and not embrace the whole world in a general love for the human race and in fraternal cooperation between all men? From today, relations from country to country, exchanges of raw materials and agricultural and industrial products are such that a country that wants to isolate itself, or worse, enter into struggle against others, would condemn itself to a reduced life and to a final disaster. Today there is an abundance of men who, through their relationships, their type of work and studies or their economic position, feel and are truly citizens of the world. And then, don't you see that everything great and beautiful is of a global, supranational character? Global science, global art, global religion which, despite its lies, is a great manifestation of the spiritual activity of humanity. Universal, Mr. Ambroise would tell you, law and morality, since everyone seeks to extend their own conception to the entire human race. Every new truth discovered anywhere in the world, every new invention, every brilliant conception of a human brain serves, or should serve, all of humanity. To return to isolation, to rivalry and hatred between people and people, to persist in a petty and anti-human patriotism, would be to put oneself outside the great currents of progress which are leading humanity towards a future of peace and fraternity. That would be putting oneself outside of civilization and in opposition to it. Caesar. You always talk about peace and fraternity, but let me ask you this practical question: if, for example, Russians or French came to Milan, to Rome, to Naples, to destroy our artistic monuments and massacre and oppress our compatriots, what would you do? Would you be happy? George. What are you saying there? I would certainly be very angry about it and I would do everything I could to prevent it. But notice that I would be equally angry and that I would do, if possible, everything to prevent it, if the Italians were going to destroy, oppress, and massacre in Paris, in Vienna, in Berlin, or in Libya. Caesar. Really angry as well? George. Actually maybe not. I would deplore the harm done in Italy more, because it is in Italy that I have the most friends, it is the things about Italy that I know best. My impressions would therefore be more vivid, more strongly felt. But that does not mean that the harm done in Berlin would be any less evil than that done in Milan. If one of my brothers, one of my friends were killed, I would certainly suffer more than when a man I do not know is killed, but that does not mean that the assassination of someone unknown to me would be any less criminal than the murder of one of my friends. Philip. Good, but what did you do to prevent a possible German descent into Milan? George. I didn't do anything. Even my friends and I did everything we could to stay out of the fray, but it was because we could not have done what would have been useful and necessary. Philip. What does this mean? George. The thing is clear. We found ourselves in the position of having to defend the interests of our bosses, our oppressors, and this by killing our brothers, workers from other countries pushed to butchery, as we ourselves were pushed to do so, by the bosses, by their oppressors. And we refuse to serve as instruments to those who are our true enemies, that is to say, to our masters. If we had first been able to free ourselves from internal enemies, then we would have had to defend our homeland and not that of these gentlemen. We would have offered a fraternal hand to the foreign workers sent against us, and if they had not understood us, if they had wanted to continue to serve their masters at our expense, we would have defended ourselves. Ambroise. But you only care about the interests of the workers, the interests of your class, without understanding that above the class there is the nation. There are feelings, traditions, interests which unite all the differences in conditions, all the class antagonisms. And then there is the pride of the race. Don't you feel proud to be Italian, to belong to the country which gave civilization to the world and which, despite everything, still today is at the forefront of progress? How did you not feel the need to defend Latin civilization against Teutonic barbarism? George. Please, let's put aside the barbarity of this country or that country. I could well tell you that if the workers do not know how to appreciate your Latin civilization, the fault is yours, the fault is the bourgeoisie which took away from the workers the means to educate themselves. How can you pretend that men are passionate about something that you let them ignore? But let's put an end to these lies. Who do you want to make believe that the Teuts are more barbaric than the others, when you yourself, a few years ago, were in admiration of everything that came from Germany? If tomorrow political conditions change and if capitalist interests are oriented differently, you will say again that the Germans are at the head of civilization and that the barbarians are the English and the French. But what does that matter? If a country is more advanced than another, it has a duty to spread civilization, to help the backward brothers, and he must not take advantage of his superiority to oppress and exploit, especially since any abuse of power leads to corruption and decadence. Ambroise. But, whatever happens, at least respect national solidarity, which must be stronger than any class competition. George. I understand well. It is this so-called national solidarity that interests you above all, and it is this that we fight above all else. Because national solidarity means solidarity between capitalists and workers, solidarity between oppressors and oppressed, this amounts to acquiescence of the oppressed to their state of subjection. The interests of the workers are opposed to those of the bosses, and when, through special circumstances, they find themselves momentarily united, we seek to make them antagonistic, because human emancipation and all future progress depend on the struggle between bosses and employees, which must lead to the complete disappearance of exploitation and oppression of man by man. You can still try to deceive the workers with the lie of nationalism, but it will be in vain. From now on, the workers have understood that their brothers are the workers of all countries and their enemies are all capitalists and all governments, foreign or not. And with that, I wish you good evening. I know that I convinced neither the magistrates nor the owners who listened to me, but for Philippe, Vincent, and Louis, who are proletarian like me, perhaps I did not speak in vain. 17. Louis, Socialist. Since everyone has said their ideas, can you allow me to also say mine? Here I am alone in my opinion, and I would not like to expose myself to the combined intolerance of the bourgeois and anarchists. George. I am surprised that you speak like this. You seem, or rather you seem, because we are both workers and we can and must consider each other as friends and brothers, you seem to believe that anarchists are the enemies of socialists. On the contrary, we are their friends and collaborators. Although many socialist leaders have tried and are still trying to put socialism and anarchism in opposition, the truth is that, if socialism means society, or aspiration for a society, where men live as brothers, where the good of all is the condition for the good of everyone, where no one is a slave and exploited, where finally everyone has the means to achieve the greatest possible development and to enjoy in peace all the benefits of civilization and general work, not only are we socialists, but we have the right to consider ourselves the strictest and most consistent socialists. Besides, and this Mr. Ambroise knows well, he who sent so many of our people to penitentiaries in Italy, it was we who first introduced, explained, and propagated socialism, and so little by little we ended up abandoning the name of socialists, and by calling ourselves simply anarchists, it is because, alongside us, another authoritarian and parliamentary school arose which managed to prevail and to make socialism such a hybrid and accommodating thing, that he could no longer reconcile himself with either our ideal or our methods and was repugnant to our temperaments. Louis. Indeed, I heard you present your ideas and we agree on many things, particularly in the criticism of capitalism. But we do not agree in everything, firstly because the anarchists only believe in revolution and renounce the more civil means of struggle which have replaced the violent methods perhaps necessary in the past, and then because, even if we were to come to a violent revolution, it would have to put in power a new government which would do things with order and not leave everything to the arbitrariness and fury of the masses. George. Well, let's talk a little. Do you truly believe that we can radically transform society, destroy privilege, oust the government, expropriate the bourgeoisie, without resorting to force? I hope that you do not have the illusion that the owners and rulers will want to give in without resistance, without using the force at their disposal and will in some way play the role of the hanged man by persuasion. If so, ask these gentlemen present who, if they could, would very willingly get rid of me and you by the most expeditious means. Louis. No, I don't have these illusions. But since workers today have the political and administrative vote and are the vast majority of voters, it seems to me that, if they knew and if they wanted, they could quite simply send men to power of confidence, socialists and, if you want, even anarchists who would make good laws, nationalize the land and factories and establish socialism. George. Good. If the workers knew and wanted. But if their evolution had reached the point where they understood the causes and remedies of their ills, then perhaps the revolution could be carried out without violence or with little violence, but they could in this case make it by themselves what they desire. It would be useless to send to Parliament and the government men who, even if they did not allow themselves to be intoxicated and corrupted by the attraction of power, as happens too often, would find themselves in the impossibility of providing for social needs and doing what voters expect of them. But it is too true that the vast majority of workers do not know and do not want to, and they are in conditions such that they do not have the possibility of morally emancipating themselves, if first of all they do not improve their material situation. This is why social transformation must be accomplished through the initiative and action of those minorities who, as a result of fortunate circumstances, have been able to rise above the common level, numerical minorities who end up being the preponderant force and by dragging with them the backward mass. Consider the facts, and you will soon see that, precisely because of the moral and material conditions in which the proletariat finds itself, the bourgeoisie and the government always succeed in obtaining the parliament that suits them. And this is why they concede and allow universal suffrage to remain. If they foresaw the danger of being legally dispossessed, they would be the first to deviate from legality and violate what they call the popular will. It's that which they already do whenever the laws inadvertently turn against them. Louis. You say that, but yet we see that the number of socialist deputies is constantly increasing. One day they will be the majority and... George. But don't you see that the socialists become tame as soon as they enter parliament? They were a danger, they become collaborators, supporters of the established order. Basically, by sending socialists to parliament, we are doing the bourgeoisie a service, because we are removing from the masses the most active, the most capable, the most popular men in order to transport them into the bourgeois atmosphere. Besides, I already told you, if the socialist deputies really became a danger, the government would drive them out of parliament with bayonets and suppress universal suffrage. Lewis. You assume it, because you always think of things as a catastrophe. On the contrary, the world advances little by little and by gradual evolution. The proletariat must prepare to replace the bourgeoisie by educating itself, organizing itself, by sending its representatives to all deliberative and legislative bodies, and when it is ready, it will take charge of all things, and the new society to which we aspire will be founded. Time takes time. It is useless and dangerous to want to force the laws of nature and history. In all civilized countries the number of socialist deputies is growing and the support they have among the masses is growing at the same time. They will certainly one day be the majority, and if, then, the bourgeoisie and its government do not want to give in peacefully and try to suppress the popular will, we will respond to violence with violence. George. My dear Lewis, the laws of nature do not need defenders, they make themselves respected. Men painfully manage to discover them and use their discoveries for good or evil. But be careful not to accept as natural laws the social facts that those concerned, in our case the economists and sociologists who defend the bourgeoisie, qualify as such. As for the laws of history, they are formulated after history is made. Let's do the history first. The world moves slowly or quickly, forwards or backwards, depending on the result of an indefinite number of natural and human factors, and it is an error to believe in continuous evolution always going in the same direction. It is certainly true that society evolves slowly and continuously, but evolution means change, and if some changes are made in the direction of what is for us the right path, that is to say favor the elevation of man towards a higher ideal of fraternity and freedom, others, on the contrary, reinforce the institutions in force or push back and cancel the progress already made. As long as the state of struggle persists between men, no conquest is certain, no progress in social organization can be considered definitively acquired. We must use and encourage all the factors of progress, and fight, stop and seek to neutralize the forces of regression and conservation. Today the destinies of humanity depend on the struggle between the exploited and the exploiters, and any conciliation between the two hostile classes, any mitigation of the struggle, any collaboration between capitalists and workers, between people and government made with the intention or under the pretext of attenuating social differences, would only serve to favor the class of oppressors, to consolidate the faltering institutions and, what is worse, to separate from the mass the most evolved proletarian elements, to make them a new privileged class, co-interested with the barons of industry, finance, and politics in maintaining the vast majority of the people in a state of inferiority and subjection. You talk about evolution and you seem to believe that necessarily, inevitably, whether men want it or not, we will arrive at socialism, that is to say, at a society created for the equal benefit of all, at a society where means of production belonging to all would be workers and would enjoy the benefits of civilization equally. But this is false. Socialism will come if men want it and if they do what is necessary to achieve it. Otherwise there could come, instead of socialism, a social state where the differences between man and man are made greater and more permanent, where humanity is divided as if into two races, masters and servants, with an intermediate class which, with the help of intelligence and brutal force, would serve to ensure the domination of some over others, or the current state could simply be perpetuated, a state of continuous struggle, of alternative improvements and aggravations, of periodic crises and wars. I would even say that if things were left to their natural course, evolution would probably go in a direction opposite to that which we would like. It would go towards a consolidation of privileges, towards a stable balance to the advantage of the current dominators. Because it is natural that strength is for the strong and that he who begins to gain certain advantages in the fight against the adversary, always gains greater ones thereafter. Lewis. Maybe you are right. But this precisely proves that we must use all the means at our disposal: education, organization, political struggle. George. All means, yes, but all means which lead to the goal. Education. Certainly. It is the first necessary thing, because, if we do not act on the minds of individuals, if we do not awaken their conscience, if we do not excite their sensitivity, if we do not arouse their will, there is no progress possible. And by education I mean not so much that instruction which is learned in books, also necessary, but so little accessible to proletarians, as the education which is acquired through conscious contact with society, propaganda, discussions, interest in public questions, participation in struggles for the improvement of one's own condition and that of others. This education of the individual is necessary and would be sufficient to transform the world, if it could be extended to everyone. Unfortunately, this is impossible. Man is influenced, dominated, I would almost say formed by the environment in which he lives. When the environment is not favorable, he can only progress by fighting against it. And there exists, at a given moment, only a limited number of individuals, able, by nature and as a result of particularly fortunate circumstances, to rise above the environment, to react against it and to contribute to transform it. And this is why it is the conscious minority who must break the ice and violently change external circumstances. The organization. An excellent and necessary thing, provided that it is done to fight the bosses and not to agree with them. Political struggle. Naturally, provided that we mean struggle against the government and not cooperation with it. And then, note carefully, if we want to improve, make bearable the capitalist system, and consequently consecrate and perpetuate it, then certain accommodations, certain collaborations may seem acceptable, but if we really want to bring down the system, we must then place ourselves clearly outside of him and against him. And since the revolution is necessary, since in any case it will have to come to the revolution, doesn't it seem to you that we must now prepare ourselves morally and materially, instead of giving illusions to the masses and to weaken them by the hope of an emancipation without sacrifices and without bloody struggles? Lewis. Good. Suppose you are right and that revolution is inevitable. In fact, there are so many socialists who say the same. But it will still be necessary to form a new government to organize and lead the revolution. George. And why? If there are not among the masses a sufficient number of revolutionaries, manual workers, and intellectual workers, the revolution does not take place or fails. And if this number is there, what good will a government be except to paralyze popular initiative and in fact to truncate the revolution itself? In fact, what do you want a government to do, whether parliamentary government or dictatorship? It should above all think about ensuring its duration, that is to say, constituting an armed force to defend itself against its adversaries and impose its will on the recalcitrant. Then he would have to inform himself, study, seek to reconcile conflicting wishes and interests, and therefore make laws, which probably would satisfy no one. However, we would have to live. However, either property would have passed de facto into the hands of the workers, and then, as everyday needs must be provided for, the workers themselves would have to face the needs of life without waiting for the decisions of those in power, to whom all that would remain, would be to declare their uselessness as rulers and to blend into the crowd as simple workers. Either the property would have remained in the hands of the owners, and then these who, holding the wealth and disposing of it as they pleased, would remain the true arbiters of social life, would ensure that the government, composed of socialists, not anarchists, because anarchists want neither to govern nor to be governed, is reduced to bending to the wishes of the bourgeoisie or is soon broken. I will not elaborate further. I have to leave and don't know when I will return. We will go a while without seeing each other. Think about what I told you. I hope when I return to find a new companion. Good health to all. Errico malatesta.